Hey Gettys nerds, 2024 is shaping up to be a fun year for Addressing Gettysburg, and we want you to join us. Our Get Out of the Car tours, put together and led by licensed battlefield guide Louis Trott, kick off in April and will be available at a later date for the first time ever on our YouTube channel. Speaking of our YouTube channel, Gettysburg National Military Park's Winter Lecture Series is available exclusively over there from January through March. So be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss a single one. We have much more in the works, so be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and now for free on Patreon. We hope to get to meet and spend time with many of you this year as we spread the word about the Battle of Gettysburg and the Civil War. Help us teach the masses that history is not boring. Movies and documentaries about history are spread out across the internet, and their quality is often suspect. History Fix delivers curated historic programming to your preferred device using their website or branded apps. Join History Fix for movies, documentaries, short films, and how-tos. Addressing Gettysburg podcast fans receive 20% off their first annual subscription. So what are you waiting for? Sign up at www.historyfix.com and use promo code ADGBURG. That's ADGBURG.
This episode of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you in part by me, audiobook narrator Mike Scott, narrator of Savis Beattie's Bloody Autumn, the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864, and Unlike Anything That Ever Floated, the Monitor and Virginia and the Battle of Hampton Roads. If you are an author or publisher interested in having your titles produced as audiobooks, or even just in learning more about the process, give me a shout. You can find my contact info on my website, MikeScottVoice.com. That's MikeScottVoice.com.
Want the freshest cup of coffee in Gettysburg? Then visit Bantam Roasters, formerly 82 Cafe at 82 Steinware Avenue. They roast all of their coffee in-house, and they have a full coffee bar to keep you caffeinated during your trip. Visit them at www.raggededgerc.com for their menu and shipping options for all of their freshly roasted coffee. Use promo code HANCOCK for 10% off your order in the cafe.
And Civil War Trails. It's the world's largest open-air museum, and they offer over 1,300 sites across 6 states. Drive the Gettysburg campaign turn by turn, paddle to Frederick Douglass's birthplace, or hike to remote earthworks and artillery positions. Visit civilwartrails.org to request a brochure and explore their interactive map. Follow Civil War Trails and create some history of your own.
You're listening to the Addressing Gettysburg podcast with Matt Callery.
The Gettysburg Museum of History Studios.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg's Ask a Gettysburg Guide. And today we are doing something that I said to Dave, who's the guy who schedules everybody. I said, Dave, this year I want to focus on brigades and maybe some regiments, but units and individuals. And so he said, okay, your wish is my command. And I said, great. And then Zackery Fry, who has been on the show before on Patreon, he contacted me. It was about a month or two ago, I guess, and asked if I wanted to do one on Hall's Brigade. And I said, sure, that's perfect. But because Zach's not a licensed guide, though he is very qualified to speak on this, the format of the show is Ask a Gettysburg Guide. And so I said, I just got to team you up with a guide. And he said, anybody but Wayne Motts. But Wayne was the only one available. So I have Zackery Fry with me
because
and Wayne Motts.
I want to get a word in edgewise.
Yeah. Right. So we got Zackery Fry and Wayne Motts. Welcome, guys. Thanks for coming and doing this.
Appreciate it.
All right. So, by the way, I want to say we've been doing the winter lectures, and pull the mic in front of your mouth more. We've been doing the winter lectures, and Pete Carmichael was doing his, and he went to mention your book, A Republic in the Ranks.
Yes, he's the series editor for that.
And he forgot the title.
He forgot the, well.
And I, in the back, yelled it out.
Forgetting the title is better than forgetting the author.
See, I always forget the authors.
Yeah.
The titles are easier for me to remember.
Okay.
Because they tend to be more creative. Names, they're all, please. But anyway, I just want to know, I saved your butt. And
well, I appreciate that.
And that the name is getting exposure now.
So the royalty check, some of it
should start rolling in anytime soon. within the next 100 years.
Tens of dollars.
Yes, exactly. All right, so we're going to talk about Norman Hall's brigade. This is a brigade that people may not think of. You think of some of the more, Vincent's brigade or, Garnett's brigade or all these different brigades, the Iron Brigade. But nobody ever really talks about Hall's brigade. Yet they have some pretty, I don't know if you want to say famous regiments, but accomplished regiments in them. And at least as far as monuments go here on the battlefield, the 42nd New York has one of the more interesting ones. And they were at Pickett's charge. I mean, they were there, right there in the center of the line. And yet we don't know Norman Hall's name as much. And so why don't we get into that? Who was he? Who's Norman Hall?
Wayne, you want to? I got plenty on him.
I'm sure you do, and maybe I know you've got. I'm honored to be along with you. Zack and I have common interest related to this brigade, and related to the fight, of course, on the 3rd. Even though this brigade is also on the 2nd, but Hall being a West Pointer, why don't you give the history? And we can answer the question why you don't hear about him pretty easily. It's because he dies at an extremely young age in 1867.
How old?
I think he's 30 years old when
30
I think he's
years
30
old.
years old when
So
he dies.
here at Gettysburg, he's a colonel?
He's a colonel, and he's about 27 years old.
Right. 27.
He's one of the.
Right.
He's definitely one of the youngest brigade commanders. I mean, not counting guys like Custer who were like 12 or 13, but like of the mortals, and certainly of the infantry commanders, he's probably in the 3 or 4 youngest brigade commanders, and he's still a colonel.
And he was earmarked for, I think, a lot of interesting things. If you look at his career, he had a tremendous career. He'd been wounded, of course, at Antietam. He had a tremendous career as a graduate at West Point. And if you look at that division, Harrow's the only one that's not a West Point graduate. Okay. So Hall's a West Point graduate. Gibbon, the division commander, is a West Point graduate. Webb is a West Point graduate. When you look at the professionalism, not that we're not saying those guys aren't professional, but the military professionalism in that division, very tough. And very interesting. So, Zack, why don't you give what you got on? I'm sure you've got a lot on him, but the answer to that question immediately is because he died, and he died at a very young age. Okay, I think, in my opinion.
He did. Well, thanks, Wayne, and thanks for doing this with me. I definitely appreciate it. I know Wayne and I are both Ohioans. We both went to Ohio State. Wayne for undergrad, me for grad school, and so we got that in common. Unfortunately, we're talking about a Michigander here. Norman
Sometimes
Hall.
We even talk about them, but we'll talk slower so everybody understands it. Make sure everybody understands it. So go ahead.
He's actually born in New York, and I was wrong. He's 26 years old at Gettysburg. Okay. So he moves to Monroe, Michigan in the late 1840s. And enters West Point mid-1850s at a point where the curriculum at West Point actually is 5 years in the 1850s instead of 4 years. So he graduates in 59, right around the middle of his class. I think it's a class of 22, and he graduates 13th in it, if I'm remembering correctly. A lot of what I know about Hall, I want to give a shout-out to a friend of mine, Dave Finney, who I believe is from Monroe, Michigan, but he's done a tremendous amount of research on Hall.
Is Hall from Monroe?
He is.
Oh, okay. Like
he lives
Custer.
like Custer. He lives in Monroe before the war. Hall serves in the regular army before the war, and basically his claim to fame when the war breaks out is that he is at he is at Fort Sumter. Yeah. He is stationed at Fort Sumter. He's present he's actually stationed originally at Fort Moultrie, but gets evacuated, sent to Sumter. And he is there when the fort is fired on. He is there during the bombardment. He actually saves the flag during the bombardment after it's shot down. He's like running through the barracks as they're on fire. He gets very badly burned. He's there during the salute. He gets injured when the gun during the 100-gun salute blows up. Your listeners aren't familiar with that story. That was like the first fatality, I believe, of the formal part of the war. One of the guns blows
nobody
up.
died in the bombardments.
Right.
The Confederates are bombarding Fort Sumter. Nobody died.
Everybody survives.
The people died in the salute. So a couple of them died in the salute.
Right.
Which is
if that wasn't a portent of things to come.
Can you imagine that? They survived that entire bombardment, and Hall gets injured.
So
what a terrible.
I think the most important thing, though, for Hall that comes out of his experience in the Charleston area at the outbreak of the war is that he contracts what we think is typhoid fever.
Okay.
And he will never recover from that. Hall will die of complications from typhoid, as Wayne mentioned, in 1867. So he never recovers from typhoid, and it lingers with him in recurring bouts throughout his experience in the war, including here at Gettysburg. Yeah. There are multiple periods in the war where Hall is sent home on sick leave or sort of commanding from an ambulance wagon. He's very reluctant to relinquish command, and here at Gettysburg, the typhoid fever seems to have led to some sort of heart complication. Which I looked it up on Mayo Clinic. It turns out if you have typhoid long enough, it can really mess with your heart muscle.
Really?
And he says that his heart palpitations here during the Gettysburg campaign are beyond the power of words to express.
I'll bet.
Was so incredibly painful.
Because you add to that just the stress of being on campaign.
Exactly.
And Army life in general.
Exactly. And I think as far as Hall is concerned in terms of his leadership, one of the things that I think really distinguishes Hall and sort of separates him from a lot of the other brigade commanders in the Army of the Potomac is his ability not just to see what's going on right in front of him, but also his ability to look around him and see what's going on. When we get to battles like Antietam or battles like Fredericksburg, where his brigade is the first one across the Rappahannock River. In fact, his hometown regiment, the 7th Michigan, is the one that crosses the river under fire. But even when we get to Gettysburg and you read his official report, you read about what's going on and what his troops are doing, it's clear that he's seeing everything that's going on around him and trying to solve crises that are unfolding.
Right.
Over here beyond the left of his brigade on July 2nd, over here to his right on July 3rd. He's even at one point sending staff officers back to the artillery reserve because he thinks they need some more artillery up here to support his brigade on Cemetery Ridge. He's functioning at a very high level.
So why is he not a general? If he's commanding the brigade at Fredericksburg, that's December of 62.
Right.
And he's here in July of 63, still a colonel.
There's an interesting answer to that question, I think, which kind of touches on part of why I've been so interested in this guy and in this unit for so long. He was very good friends with the officers of the 20th Massachusetts, and I'm sure that's something that Wayne will want to talk about as well, because he and I both like the 20th Massachusetts and some of these officers. But they leave behind a lot of documentation and letters home about what's going on in the dynamics within the brigade. And the 7th Michigan is an interesting unit because their lieutenant colonel also goes on to command a brigade here at Gettysburg. Henry Baxter.
Oh, okay.
Baxter's originally from the 7th Michigan.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
And he actually leapfrogs Hall into brigadier general rank. Baxter's a lieutenant colonel. Hall's a colonel. Baxter goes into a brigade command with a star on his shoulders, and Hall
did he know somebody?
He knew somebody. It's
all you know, folks.
So one of the officers in the 20th Massachusetts writes, he said, Hall will never be promoted because of his politics.
Yeah.
And he was a Democrat?
Hall, we're pretty sure, was a Democrat.
Yeah. Okay.
Most of the commanders in this brigade were Democrats. That's something that I've been fascinated in for a long time.
A lot of the officers in the 20th Mass, like Henry Livermore Abbott, they're Democrats. So you get his father was a Democratic Abbott that we'll talk a little bit more about, who has great letters in 20th Mass. Zack and I love that.
Yep.
That he comes from a Democratic background and was state representative and held a number. So this is a very interesting point.
Yeah.
That because these promotions, a lot of it, that depends on those things.
You have to know a senator.
Yeah.
You have to know a senator. So in Hall's case, he's either going to have to know a senator, probably from Michigan, like Zackery Chandler, who's a radical Republican, or somebody from New York, which is where he's actually living during the war, where his wife lives during the war. And he just doesn't have that advantage.
Oh man, I mean, because I was brushing up last night and reading about it, and you're right. Like when Humphrey's division's in trouble.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, he's not doing it. He's not saying, "Oh, they need help." Like it was requested, but still, he just immediately sends troops down to help out. And he's paying attention not only to what's going on in his front, but around him as well, which sounds like a very attentive commander, someone that you want in command.
We should say, too, that being a Democrat in the Army of the Potomac, this is not, Zach knows much more about it than I do. This is not an unusual situation.
No.
And let's remember that many of these senior Army officers, they come from conservative backgrounds, which at that time is going to be the Democrats. This is going to be Hancock. It's going to be Meade. If you look at the hierarchy of the Army, they're not on the Doubleday side.
Right.
Doubleday is an outlier.
And Hall doesn't like Doubleday.
Yeah.
Hall mentions that. I don't like Doubleday.
And Doubleday is a Democrat or a Republican?
Doubleday is one of the few Republicans.
Yeah. He's one of the few Republicans
in the regular Army.
Okay.
And very open about it. It's one thing to be a Republican in the regular Army. It's another thing to be very open about it.
Who else might be here that would fit this category? They're not quite. Doubleday is clear on. He's on the abolition, sort of the radical side. But Slocum, is it Slocum?
Slocum's kind of in the middle. Slocum's sort of a chameleon.
Howard, maybe. Howard?
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
Definitely. But these guys are on, I think we could say they're sort of on the outside looking in.
And Hall knew Howard as well.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt what you're saying, but I think it's important for the viewers and the listeners to understand that there's that most of these senior Army officers are Democrats. They're not the Republican Party. And you've got Hall and these others. And so trying to get a promotion, like you said, the Senate's got to confirm that. So
it's a shame. It's just everything's all politics, even back then. It's all politics. All right. So who was in command of the brigade before he rose? Because he commanded the 7th Michigan, right?
Yes, he did.
And then he rises to brigade command. Who's in command before him?
Well, before Hall takes command of the brigade commander that is perhaps most associated with the unit, at least at battles like Antietam, is Napoleon Jackson Tecumseh Dana.
That's a Civil War name. I mean, that's all of them thrown together.
He had one goal in life, I'm sure, and that was to be a general officer. And Dana is, along with most of these guys, has a very bad day on September 17th, 1862 at Antietam. Antietam is probably the darkest day in this brigade's history. It had one very dark day earlier earlier in the war at Paul's Bluff in 1861 when they got very badly hit. But in the West Woods at Antietam, in the course of about 15 minutes or so, they lose about half their number. They get just clobbered.
And what is that number, by the way? About half, roughly.
They're a pretty big brigade at that point. Do you have any idea? Maybe 2,000.
You got me there.
Because here there are 922 men.
Pretty small here, man. This is the reason why.
But that's the reason why.
Right.
That's the reason why.
Yeah.
So Dana is hit. The next guy who commands the brigade is, or at least acting brigade commander, is a guy named William Raymond Lee of the 20th Massachusetts.
Okay.
An older guy, kind of a grandfatherly guy to the 20th Massachusetts. He actually suffers a mental breakdown after Antietam because of everything he saw. One of the officers of the 20th Massachusetts happened upon him during the march away from Antietam in Keedysville in a barn. He said broke, drunk, and having soiled himself.
Oh God!
He was so overwhelmed by everything he had seen so far, and the officers of the 20th Massachusetts said, "We took care of him. We called for his wife," and that was basically the last they saw of Lee.
Isn't there some kind of account that he was like a child?
Exactly.
Like a child.
He looked reverted.
He acted like a... Yep. And he had been to West Point. He didn't graduate, but he had several years. He was there almost up to the time of graduation before he became an engineer and worked for the railroad. His career is an interesting career, but he didn't graduate from West Point, but he's there. And this just shows you the mental aspect, which is a whole nother episode someday, because I'm very interested in those.
Me too. So am I. Yeah. About that. We should do an episode about that.
I'm telling you, it's tremendous, and unfortunately, there's a lot of folks that it affects. He's one of those cases. I mean,
and there are other guys in the 20th Massachusetts as well, like Oliver Wendell Holmes, who get very affected by this. Very affected. They're haunted by the war their whole lives.
So they get to Gettysburg now. Let's get them here. Well, let's talk a little bit about Fredericksburg real quick, because you're right. Like, so the 7th Michigan, 19th Mass and the 20th Mass, they're going to cover the engineers as they're building the pontoon bridges.
That's right.
And they're under fire. They're protecting them. They're, whatever. Tell us about that particular action there, because I mean that I can't imagine that, especially from the perspective of the engineers. But how
that's
hard?
True. Yeah, from the engineer perspective, it must have really sucked.
Because you're trying to work, and these bullets are flying.
Yeah. Well,
but for Hall's men, what are they doing? Are they against an actual battle line on the other side of the river, or is it more of a skirmish line?
No, it's very much the Confederates are occupying the river front. They're occupying the houses down along Sophia Street. I think it's Sophia Street.
Yep.
And they're firing at the engineers, and Hall basically volunteers his brigade, and Burnside is right there.
He volunteers them?
I'm pretty sure he volunteers.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And Burnside is sort of like, well, if you think you can do it, fine. And so Hall and the 7th Michigan are going to get in the boats and establish a bridgehead. They're going to cross the Rappahannock, which is not, it's not the Potomac, but it's not a small creek.
Right.
They're going to cross this river under fire, climb up the slope on the other side, and begin deploying in a very unconventional combat environment. There's no doctrine in the United States Army at the time for dealing with anything like this.
Right.
So the 7th Michigan has a very hard time fighting its way up Hawk Street and Fauquier Street. And eventually the 20th Massachusetts gets called upon to do that, to support the 7th Michigan. And 20th Massachusetts, led by our hero, Henry Livermore Abbott, who's one of these captains in the unit, or maybe he's a lieutenant at that point, I can't remember, but he's commanding Company I. He takes his company up to the intersection of Fauquier Street and Main Street, I think it's called at the time. Now it's Caroline Street. And they suffered 100 casualties just over the course of doing that. And most of it is in the twilight. Too.
And we should say for the Gettysburg listeners, this is Barksdale's brigade.
Yes,
These men are up against Barksdale.
Yeah.
And the 20th Mass, Henry Livermore Abbott, his best friend, is commanding the company against him.
That's true.
Oh, really?
On that, and were they roommates at?
I think they were at Harvard.
At Harvard, they went to Harvard together.
Really?
His name was Lane Brandon. Lane Brandon was an officer in the 21st Mississippi Infantry Regiment. His father was colonel of that unit. And Lane Brandon and Henry Livermore Abbott of the 20th Mass. These guys are best friends.
Wow.
And they're fighting each other right there on Hawk Street. It's a fascinating, story.
Yeah, it's another one of those stories that just makes you go, God, I can't imagine. It helps put you in their shoes, right? A little better than if you just hear the story about this side versus that. Right. These guys
Brandon
are best
survives
friends.
the Civil War. He doesn't die until up in the 20th century, and there's an account of them trying to exchange pictures. They try to float boats across the river to try to communicate to each other. But it's interesting. And we also should say, when you mentioned the first action of Hall's brigade at Ball's Bluff,
guess who they're fighting?
That these guys are against. Guess who they're against?
Yep.
The 8th Virginia of Eppa Hudd's brigade, which is the same unit they're against
here
in Pickett's shop.
Yeah.
Exact same unit. So
they're familiar with each other.
There's a lot of history, I think.
Yeah.
This brigade has a fascinating history because at some of these places they're going to end up facing these units twice.
And that's why I'm so surprised they're not more famous. I mean, I know Hall, his story and stuff, but if someone else could have told the story, it doesn't have to just be him.
But every unit is like that. Every unit has the reasons why it should be interesting or fascinating.
That's a great point. You're right. You hear these stories and you go, wow, but they're not really uncommon stories.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Is your point?
You just have to find them. Yeah.
To be fair, when Wayne and I are discussing this Henry Livermore Abbott character, whose books were published by Kent State back in the early 90s, the author says, and I want to make sure I get the quote right, he says in the introduction, Abbott was without question the most widely known, most highly respected officer of his rank ever to serve in the Army of the Potomac.
Okay.
And I think that's a good point. Everybody, all the generals in the Army of the Potomac, or at least many of them, like Sedgwick, for instance, Hancock and others, knew and respected Abbott and some of these other officers in Hall's brigade.
Yeah.
And not even because they were regular Army officers, they weren't. But they saw the seriousness with which men like Abbott took to soldiering as non-professionals, and they were really impressed by it.
How about, go ahead.
I'm sorry, the 19th Mass, we'll talk more, I'm sure. Edmund Rice, who's the major here at Gettysburg, had gone to Norwich and, later became a commander in the Spanish-American War. This guy retires as a general after 40 years service. Didn't start out as a professional soldier, but he ended up choosing the Army as his career.
Found he liked it.
These guys know, very familiar. And the commonness between the two, between them, obviously Hall knowing these men, and Henry Livermore Abbott that Zach and I are discussing. He graduated with Robert Gould Shaw. These guys are classmates at Harvard together. So this is a well-educated brigade. Many of these officers that serve in this brigade are well-educated. Not that others aren't, but I mean, for a college education in the Civil War, that's not that typical.
Right.
Very rare.
And it also means we have a lot of source material.
Yes, because they
can write. Yeah. What was the monument that's the pudding stone? Is that the 20th?
20th.
It is.
Yeah, 20th Mass. And what's the story with that? Is that really the boulder that they played around as kids?
It supposedly came out of Roxbury, right? Doesn't it come out of Roxbury? I think is where it comes out of. But I don't know if it comes out of exactly where they.
For people in the audience though who don't know what I'm talking about, there's a monument on the battlefield that is kind of out of place because it's not really sculpted. It's just a big boulder.
It is a Massachusetts pudding stone. I mean, right? We can say that.
And it's delicious if you go and lick it.
Don't start something like that. Yeah. I'm sure the park would love that.
Yeah.
All these people licking.
Do not lick the monument.
Do not lick the monument. It's a joke. But no. So the story I heard, and I probably got a detail or two wrong, is that the boys in this regiment used to play in a park or in the woods somewhere around this boulder and climb on it and everything. And then when they came back and made their monument, they brought the boulder and made it out. Is that the story? Number one. Number two, is that correct?
The way I heard, I looked this up the other night on newspapers.com because I wanted to find what are the newspapers saying about the dedication of this monument?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out there wasn't really a dedication. I don't think there was a dedication ceremony for the 20th Massachusetts Monument. So there's no speechifying about this stone was where Henry Abbott and Henry Ropes or some of these other officers scurried when they were. So it wasn't like that. It said it was a pudding stone of the Roxbury area, and that was it. When I was looking, there's another great book about this topic by a couple gentlemen named Root and Stocker called "Isn't This Glorious?" It's about the 15th, 19th, and 20th Massachusetts at Gettysburg, and they dig into this and. Basically, what they found is there's no provenance for the story beyond John Vanderslice's old, guidebook or whatever.
Gettysburg Then and Now. Gettysburg Then and Now. So that's interesting because I didn't realize that. So that's where that story comes from, but you didn't find it in any of the newspaper articles.
Did not.
So it's definitely a Massachusetts pudding stone. It's actually probably from Roxbury, but whether or not it came from this thing,
and whether or not that story about them playing as kids on it, and everything,
doesn't seem like that provenance.
To me is like a movie ending.
Oh my gosh!
Right? Yeah. It reminds me kind of like the ending of A League of Their Own.
It's a beautiful story if it were true.
Tipton went out. The Historical Society the Adams County Historical Society here has great images of Tipton shooting when that monument came onto the battlefield because this thing weighs it's 20 tons or something, isn't it? Or I forget how much is it. I forget. It's massive. But
that's what battlefield guides are for. How much does it weigh?
And somehow they have to get it from the railroad that ran down there. And the Historical Society has got images of it being put on a wagon, which I can't even imagine, and getting it over to where the location of it.
How many oxen or horses would have to pull that?
I can't remember how many it is, but it's one of the things that shows how difficult it was given the weight of that to get it physically here.
Fascinating.
And then get it off the wagen you're on the grass.
I don't
you're
know.
Not on
they had some kind of
paved road.
They must have had some kind of pulley system.
Oh yeah.
They had something they got it on, but The Historic Society published a book, William Tipton, Gettysburg Fattar. It's got a blue cover. It's 8.5 by 11. And if the listeners don't have it, it's out there. You can buy it.
Actually, I might have it in the bookshelf.
And they've got that series of images in there.
Yeah.
They've got this series that Zach's talking about, and it's tremendous trying to get that. The weight of it, just trying to get it around
amazing.
the battlefield.
Another thing worth mentioning about that monument, it is not situated originally where the veterans intended.
Right.
Oh, really?
No, that monument, the 15th Massachusetts Monument and the 19th Massachusetts Monument, were actually up at the copse of trees where those plaques are.
Yes.
Veterans came back later and saw the monument had been moved and were a little surprised.
And if you go out there on certain days, like in the wintertime, you can see the depression in the ground where those monuments were. You can see where the base.
So now I got to go look at that. I love that stuff.
And if you get one of these old images, you can almost line it up because they've got pictures of the monuments with the Kadori House in the back end.
Okay.
And you can see where the 20th Mass clearly was in the ground.
Why was it moved? It was moved by the War Department or Parks? Batchelder did it?
Yeah.
It's because they didn't have brigade line. Remember, the rules were that you had to be along a brigade line, so these guys are trying, and Massachusetts is getting in there first, right? I mean, the Massachusetts monuments are like 1885. They're some of the earliest memorials here. So they're like, and there used to be a road that went right behind those monuments too, Harrow Avenue, which isn't there anymore. Here you go, Zach's got all of it on there, but it's
I had to figure out exactly what is the order in which these monuments are constructed because I'm.
So you have that?
Yeah,
I'm wow,
reasonably sure that the 7th Michigan and the 59th New York were the two last to be put up on that part of the field. Yeah.
So, and that's because probably New York is probably 1889 and Massachusetts is 1885, right?
Right.
So Massachusetts was very early, and then they put the post up. They had signs and we have early pictures. Not only were the monuments there, but the signs were there.
Now, the signs are there. That the veterans put those up. What are you're talking about the iron plaques or bronze plaques?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if the GBMA. I don't know who actually got them up. I'm not sure, but they had the memorials and then plaques that had what they were, and you can see photographs of both of those when you see it. And
that's interesting.
It's just fascinating. But Massachusetts is the first regimental monument on the battlefield is the Second Mass over at Culp's Hill. It's the first regimental memorial on the battlefield. It's a Massachusetts monument. So Massachusetts was very early in getting these things up.
So we'll get to this more when we get into the battle, but just for the sake of the monument talk here, if I recall it correctly, with the 59th and 7th Michigan are assigned to the wall, and then Hall puts the other three in reserve, correct? When he first arrives.
On July 2nd?
On July 2nd, right? Okay.
They're in two different lines, and then some are sent forward, to go against Wright's
and the
brigade.
42nd are sent down to...
Well, right. So the 19th and the 42nd are sent to aid Humphreys.
Correct.
But then... So that's an interesting. All right, let's get into the battle. So let's get up to Gettysburg now. Okay, because this is a good story. All right, so now they arrive on July 2nd. When?
Sometime mid-morning, probably.
Yeah,
mid-morning.
They put in the official records that I think approximately when they're going to, depending on which report you're.
Yeah.
Hancock marches the Second Corps pretty hard to get there. Correct?
Yeah, they have a really hard day's march. What is it, on June 29th, I want to say? It's brutal.
Yeah, like 100, is it like 100-something miles, or is that total from when...
It's not 100 miles in a day or two, but it's
No, that would be suicidal.
Yeah, I was going to say, but it sounds impossible.
It's brutal. I mean, you can tell as soon as Meade takes command on June 28th, they are hoofing
everything accelerates.
Yes.
So they get there originally. I think they rest kind of on the right of the Tawnytown Road, and then they're sent to their position that we know now today, right over at the angle there. Mm-hmm. They fill in to the left of the 69th PA with the 59th New York, 7th Michigan at the wall.
Correct.
And then the remainder are going to be back a little bit, like what, on the east side of the ridge, or where would they have gone? It doesn't
probably
really
back
matter.
Where the memorials are there today. I don't, it depends. In the morning, I don't think they've got to worry about any artillery fire from any Confederate.
Really?
I mean, you're not worried about that. So the monuments at 42nd, as you know, the 19th has a monument that's it's back. So it looks like they're probably in column too. They're probably I don't know, waiting to move somewhere.
Right.
Because you don't know, I guess, when they first get there, if you have to move, they usually don't put them in a line of battle if they know, hey, we may have to go over here or we may have to go over here.
Sure.
So I think those guys might have been even in column.
Ready to go.
Line.
Now, July 2nd, pretty quiet for them. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Longstreet's assault begins. Then what? Take it from there.
Go ahead, Zach. I mean, they had a front row seat, didn't they? I mean, looking at the right of Humphrey's line and what the movement out there and what all that looked like.
Right. Well, they would have seen
these guys.
They would have seen some of Harrow's men go out to the Emmitsburg Road to try to shore up Sickles' right flank. So they, as Wayne said, they would have had a front row seat for the collapse of Humphrey's division, probably talking like 6 o'clock in the evening.
No, let me ask you real quick. Yeah. Sorry. Before all that begins, before units are being stripped from other parts of the line to go save Sickles' leg, is there anyone to the left of Hall's brigade?
Other than, Harrow's men. Or Harrow, I don't know how we pronounce it. His brigade.
So they're there.
They're there, but they're quickly going to be parceled out. First Minnesota is going to go down to help out Evan Thomas's battery. 15th Massachusetts, 82nd New York are going to go out to basically cover Ware's battery and Brown's battery out along the Emmitsburg Road. And then I'm missing one.
And in the First Corps, they relieved some of the First Corps units that were there. They go, they're around there somewhere. They've got, I'm not sure we know exactly where they are, but what's left of part of the First Corps, Stone's Brigade, right? I mean, there are units of the First Corps that are left over there, and then you've got this artillery line, which will eventually go across there.
Talking McGillivray?
From McGillivray, I don't know what time all those guns get in position down there, but eventually they're going to try to fill in some holes for that. And some of these units are brought, Willard, some of them are brought from the right of the line down to the left of the line as this continues to go. So this stuff gets parceled off.
So
if you're in Hall's brigade, you're getting pretty much parceled off. You've got guys in front of you. You got guys that are sent over to try to shore up this collapse of the right flank.
Yeah.
And you probably had, I don't know, did the 7th Michigan, they probably had skirmishers out there, too.
They did.
Very early.
The 20th Massachusetts had skirmishers out there, too, I think. Yeah. A lot of skirmishers going on.
You've got skirmishers that are out across where the Emmitsburg Road is going to be located.
But you must be, if you're Hall and you're seeing the, Harrow's brigade being stripped away, and now there's this chasm between you and Humphreys all the way out on the Emmitsburg Road, that must be an uneasy situation. Yeah. Now, he's going to send the 19th and the 42nd to aid Harrow. Is that a request from Harrow? How does that happen?
Yeah, he said, if I remember correctly, in fact, I think I have his OR here.
Christensen?
It may be.
Staff officer.
He just says a staff officer.
Yeah.
I think I have the name Christensen here.
This is Hall. He said, these regiments, 42nd New York, 19th Massachusetts, were the last of our troops to fall back at that point. And in their regularity presented a striking contrast with the fugitives. But he just talks about a staff officer leading those two regiments out to try to help Humphreys, because Humphreys' division is collapsing. I mean, they've been hit very hard from two different directions, and it's a very quick action for the 19th and the 42nd. And they basically just cover the retreat of Humphrey's division, and then get out themselves.
It's Lieutenant Henry Christensen, if anybody's curious. Says it says here ordered. I'm using Godfrey's.
I wonder what the source is for that.
Yeah,
that could be something else, but certainly Hall doesn't name who it is, I don't think. Right?
Jim Hessler was in the other day, and we did one on Humphrey's division, and so in preparing for that, I read that they sent Christensen to go get help. Oh, so that adds up. But the thing is, I don't know how Christensen, a lieutenant from another corps, not even the same corps, could order Hall to do anything. He could probably go and request it, right? I mean, unless Hall is under orders to take orders from Humphrey in support. Which I don't know. Is that the case?
Could be.
Who knows? But anyway,
yeah.
But when the 19th and the 42nd go over there, there's an interesting conversation between the colonels.
Yeah. Basically, they see just how stuck out they are. They see just how desperate the situation seems to be. There's no real hope for them to make a very determined stand. They basically say, look, we're going to fire a couple volleys, and then we're going to get out. And we don't know exactly, or at least I don't know, maybe Wayne can illuminate this a little bit, but I don't know exactly where they go. No two maps seem to agree exactly on where they go. I think it's somewhere down sort of in front of where Hancock's wounding marker is. Somewhere down there is
south. It's probably south of Cadore Farm. It's probably south of the Cadore Farm and somewhere north of where the Klingel Farm is.
Okay.
Down in that.
It's a big area.
And that is a big area, but give us a break, right?
Yeah.
160 years. Yeah.
Colonel Mallon is sort of, his report sort of, honestly, is a little insulting about Humphrey's men, who, again, have been very badly handled, and they're a good division. And Mallon says, at this time, the troops to the front were precipitately retiring in great disorder. To avoid the enfilading effect of the fire, which was now rapidly thinning the ranks, to infuse confidence in the hearts of those who, among those retreating, might have some manhood left. The regiment formed line.
Jeez.
So it's that sort of spirit that gets these guys down there to try and cover the retreat.
So, but they decide though that because they're not going to just turn around and go, they're going to do something. So, what do they decide to do?
Well, they're definitely shooting. I mean, they're trying to cover what that would be. That doesn't mean everybody's running.
No.
I mean, it means that they're trying to make a stand there to hold, to make an orderly withdrawal probably would be my guess on that.
So I have I have a quote from Mallon. He and Devereaux is the 19th commander.
Mm-hmm.
Mallon is 42nd New York. That they're going to go behind a small knoll. They're going to, quote, lie down, wait until our retreating line has passed, delivered a volley by rear and front ranks to check the pursuing enemy, and then make good on our retreat. So that was the plan.
Yeah.
And then, is that what they did?
What small knoll do you think that is? I mean, is that where Hancock was, or is that too far back?
It's kind of what I've always suspected, but I suppose that knoll extends, or it's kind of a shelf of that knoll extends a little bit farther to the west.
Yeah. Because once you get past there, there's not many knolls. It's all lower ground.
It's pretty low.
Yeah. But we're talking about micro terrain here, just enough to conceal these guys behind it in the smoke and everything. It's possible they might be out in front.
It's true. You don't need a lot. You don't need a giant hill. You could just have a little something. Yeah. All right. So, all that's going on. Sickles' line is collapsing, and Hall's waiting and watching, and his two regiments. They don't come back right away, the 19th and 42nd. They're going to come back later, correct?
That's my understanding.
Yeah. I believe it was actually like night after the next phase, or the next thing that Hall's brigade has to deal with is over. And that is Wright's brigade.
Right.
So now go into that.
So while the 19th and the 42nd are fighting probably Lang's Florida Brigade, or at least Lang and maybe the right flank of Ambrose Wright's brigade, the next Confederate brigade to come up, Wright's Confederates, his Georgia Brigade, is headed for Cemetery Ridge, and they are headed for Brown's Battery B, 1st Rhode Island. They are headed for those two regiments, the 7th Michigan and 59th New York, as well as the 69th Pennsylvania to the right of Hall. And that's obviously a source of great controversy, exactly as, how far did Wright get? I tend to think that Wright penetrated about where the United States regular obelisk is, or perhaps a bit farther south than that, maybe got even as far up as Hancock Avenue. But his left flank would have pretty much been brought to a halt by the 7th Michigan, 59th New York, and 69th Pennsylvania. So those guys, those two regiments, the 7th and the 59th, had a very tough firefight with Wright's brigade as Ware's battery and Brown's battery were retreating toward the stone wall for safety in front of them.
There's an interesting story with Weir's battery, I believe it is. It gets captured, right?
Does get captured, yeah. So does half of, at least one or two guns of Brown's battery.
Right. And but then some of the Hall's brigade fires into the Confederates. So the Confederates they're capturing the guns. Right. They're standing waving their flag and everything, and they're being all braggadocious. And then the Yankees start firing into them.
Yeah, it said one Confederate officer, I think Mount. I'm not sure if it was Weir's battery or Brown's battery, but it was somewhere in front of Hall's brigade, and I think the whole company of it might have been the 59th New York or the 69th Pennsylvania. Aimed for a Confederate on one of those guns and brought him down in Confederate confetti. Just horrible.
What a great way to put
carnage in front of Hall's brigade.
Right.
For a few brief minutes.
One of the officers killed out there, I just saw his grave in Savannah, and he was the colonel of the 22nd, I guess. 22nd. And he was Wasden. Was his name, and he was killed on the Emmitsburg Road. And Rhode Island troops from the 2nd Rhode Island, Elijah Hunt Rhodes' regiment, comes out there on the 4th, finds him dead laying in the road. Right. And there's a great story about it because he's a Freemason, and they find a Masonic certificate in his pocket. They take it over to one of these members in the 2nd Rhode Island, Captain Foy, who's a member of the Masonic Order, and they give him Masonic burial under fire. And
really?
He was killed in this attack. He was killed there. And Nicholas Kadori, they bury him somewhere near the Kadori farm. Joseph Wasden, 22nd Georgia, Colonel of 22nd Georgia.
Wow.
And then they retrieved this body in 1871. He's buried in Savannah at Laurel Grove Cemetery, the same cemetery that Lafayette McLaws, or Lafitte McLaws, or however you want to pronounce it.
Lafayette.
I just saw his grave. I just saw it. And he certainly goes down in this, what you're describing.
Has to. Yeah.
So this is interesting, and I'm sure there's more than one story like this, but the Armistead with the Masonic burial story, is that true, or is that one of these myths that came out of the battle?
So
I mean, we know it wasn't Tom Chamberlain that came over to him. We know that.
No.
Right. But is it true that he said, "I'm son of a motherless goat," or whatever the code word code word
there
is.
There are a couple sources.
Words to that effect.
There are a couple sources that Armistead gave a Masonic sign for distress, and people helped him.
Okay.
And of that, it's in Charles Baines' history of the Philadelphia Brigade. So, and it's not the only time that occurred. This thing with Wasden is an interesting story because the men of Hall's Brigade are probably the ones that shot him down. They're not the ones that end up burying him. But this is a case where something is found on this guy's body. They take it back to somebody in the Union side, and they perform a Masonic burial of him in the battle. So it's not the only time that it happens.
See, that's what makes my brain do flips when I hear stories like that, because you'd think if this Masonic bond or any bond is strong enough for you to respectfully give the enemy a burial or give him aid as he is wounded or dying or whatever the case may be, you would think it would be strong enough to not go to war in the first place. That's the one thing that just makes me go insane.
Well, and I think with respect to the guy that Wayne was talking about a few minutes ago, Henry Abbott, roommate from Harvard.
Yeah.
I think part of what's going on with that story is you actually almost hate the individual more.
Because you loved them.
Because you were so close to them and you see what they've done.
There's a fine line between love and hate.
Yeah, I think there was an aspect of, no, I'm not going to give ground in front of this guy. But the Freemason aspect is definitely an interesting one. I've come across some pretty significant Freemason connections in the 59th New York too.
Have you? Wow. Yeah. Yeah. We don't know how many. Sheldon Munn's book on Freemasons at Gettysburg, he estimates some 17,000. But the fraternity flourished in this period, and there were many, many people that were members of it, and there are numerous stories. The park has a file on these Masonic incidences. There's not just one, there's multiple ones that are here. And then there's a book that a guy wrote, Alan Roberts, I think, and it's called House Undivided, Freemasonry in the Civil War. It's a used book.
That's
you can buy it, and it's got a lot of these stories that might come to light about some of these things. But then I found some accounts which I thought was interesting because I'm a member of the fraternity and have been for many, many years, so I'm interested in it myself. But there's something written about from one of the Grand Lodge of Virginia up to one of the New England. I might have been the 5th New Hampshire had a lot of Masons, and up to one of the Grand Lodge members. In the Civil War, they didn't have and they still don't, a national Masonic body. Each of the states have their own Grand Lodge. And so the Grand Lodge of Virginia is riding up there to New England saying, why are your Masons holding meetings without getting permission from the Grand Lodge of Virginia to hold meetings down there during the war? And so there's stuff going back.
Really?
Stuff going back and forth. Basically, the Grand Master of Virginia is very upset that these guys are having meetings down there in Virginia jurisdiction. You know, whether you're from Massachusetts or Virginia, and they're writing, stuff back and forth. And of course, they had lodge from some of the southern lodges. They had communications back and forth. It was very common practice in those times to decorate the jewels, decorate my mourning, have black ribbons on the Bible and the jewels in the Masonic Lodge where people killed every 30 days when they had a meeting. So, and in the Civil War, sometimes they never went off of having black all the time.
Yeah, makes sense.
In there. But anyway, that's a whole
That's such a weird. We should do an episode on Masons at Gettysburg.
It's interesting. It's fascinating.
Yeah. And you're a Mason?
Yeah. I'm a member here at Good Samaritan Lodge.
Did I get the, is it, I'm a son of a motherless goat?
No, we could tell you, but we'd have to kill you. One of those things. But and I'm going to give a talk pretty soon here on the 10th New York Cavalry. They're trained here at Gettysburg. I'm going to do it for the spring muster at the Gettysburg Foundation. And would you believe it that they showed me the minute book for the Masons, and 7 of the Masons visiting that lodge from the 10th New Hampshire, visiting Gettysburg Lodge, are for the 10th New York, while the 10th New York is training here. There's 7 of them in the minute book.
And that was before the battle, right?
This is 1862.
Right.
January 16, 1862.
A lot of people don't realize that there was military activity here prior.
And the minute book says, officers of the 10th New York Cavalry, it gives their first initials and last name, and it gives their Masonic Lodge, and I've tracked every one of them down.
That's cool.
Where they are, and they're attending a regular meeting here.
Yeah, we're definitely doing a Mason
It's just
episode.
It's an interesting thing. That's a whole different.
Yeah. Okay.
But we're getting off the tangent.
We are.
Hall, but one of the men that I'm sure Hall's guys shoot down or is out there along the Emmitsburg Road against Wright is one of these commanding officers for Wright's Brigade, Joseph Wasden. Fascinating.
Yeah. Very fascinating.
So, and what we don't know, which is sad, is we'll talk about July 3rd because I know you have to get into that now with our time, but the losses on the 2nd, we don't know how many guys a lot of these people had on July 3rd, right? These different regiments. I mean, you can look at the different accounts, but it's awful hard to piece together.
That's
you
what's
got
so
a lot
tricky.
Of losses
on
the second day.
That's what's so tricky about Gettysburg. It's a 3-day battle. We know the losses of a unit, but that's over 3 days.
Right.
We don't know where they lost them.
Right.
I mean, we could guess.
Right.
But
for
certain
regiments,
units,
their loss on the 2nd, I mean, they had losses on the 2nd.
And even when you go into the National Archives and really try to dig into that, I was talking to Wayne and went through the carded medical files, for instance, of the 59th New York some years ago when I was working on them. And you'd end up with accounts, official accounts, from the unit, from the federal government, basically saying, yeah, this guy was shot on, suffered a gunshot wound on July 2nd. And then it turns out, next record says he suffered a shell wound on July 3rd. Well, which was it? Maybe it was both. I don't know.
Right.
But
who's messing up?
Yeah.
And then you get their pensions, and all they do is write to the pension bureau, or the pension bureau writes the adjutant general, and then they send back and say, well, then it's got 2 or 3 things in there.
Right.
So, unless you got a recollection from the person himself, and even then you might not have the right, especially depending on how many years later they're trying to remember it.
Yeah.
Yeah, problems. But anyway, I think we should let the listeners and viewers know that there is a question as to the number of people they're going to have into action on July 3rd because we just don't know.
I mean, they're pretty small. I mean, it's 900 something men
in 5 regiments.
Yeah, in 5 regiments, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's like really stretching it thin.
150, 200 men in each regiment, basically.
Yeah. At full strength, these guys would have had 1,000. Think about that.
Right.
At full strength, they'd had 1,000 men. So you're looking at very understrength.
Right. So like on paper, this regiment or this brigade at the beginning should have been 5,000 men. If you're doing 5 regiments at 1,000, on paper, right. And now they're down to barely 1,000. All right, so go into. Let's set up July 3rd then. So what happens overnight? How do we get to all the fun on July 3rd?
These men are basically in a position where they know now that there's a good risk they could be attacked, so they are taking whatever implements they can. The 20th Massachusetts, for instance, indicates they had one shovel among them all, and they are basically building up breastworks in front of them with whatever they can: stones, fence rails, earth. It's not a lot, it's not much, but it's enough to maybe help them tomorrow. And of course, on July 3rd, as July 3rd dawns, they're hearing a lot of fighting going on elsewhere along the Union battle line. Mm-hmm. There's also a lot of very heavy cannonading on the morning of July 3rd. There's a lot of cannonading off to their right front with what's going on around the Bliss farm. But they're being subjected to some pretty, not constant, but sporadic artillery fire. And actually, in the lines of the 20th Massachusetts, there is a very bright and well-known officer who leaves behind a tremendous letter collection. Another one of these, I think he's Harvard. Henry Ropes is his name.
Okay.
And fascinating guy. He's one of these New England guys who just, he's early 20s. And he basically just, he's one of these, he's kind of nerdy, but when he gets into the Army, he just toughens himself up and becomes one of the rock of this regiment, basically. And he's actually behind the lines reading Dickens, supposedly, when a round from one of, I think it was James Rorty's battery.
Yeah, his own artillery.
Which was,
their own,
again, for the
Union
listeners,
artillery.
That's a few yards behind them, okay?
Right.
Rorty's battery is firing over the heads of the 20th Massachusetts, and Ropes is leaning up against a little tree that's behind the lines of the 20th Massachusetts, reading Dickens while this is going on, and the shell from Rorty's gun goes through Ropes' back and blows out his chest.
Oh my God!
And
he lived to tell the tale.
Well, he lived long enough apparently to say, "My God, I'm dead." So that's a catastrophic loss for the 20th Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Henry Abbott, of course, one of the survivors of this regiment of Gettysburg, at least he'll die at the Wilderness, writes in his official report that the regiment never suffered half so great a loss as that of Lieutenant Ropes. The only man he saw who served purely out of absolute patriotism. So stuff is going on in the morning. They're being subjected to artillery fire. They're seeing all the preparations for the grand assault happen in front of them. One of the things that's interesting when you read the accounts from Hall's brigade, or a lot of these guys on the Union line, is they all purport to know about exactly how many Confederate guns are ultimately firing at them. And I think part of what's going on is these guys are seeing it around midday, and some of them, undoubtedly know what's coming.
Yeah.
And they're like counting the guns almost
to
pass the time. Like,
probably.
Oh, there's, look at that battery over there. There's 6 more. Oh my God, there's 12 more guns over here. So they know something's coming.
So you're saying this is before the bombardment?
Yes.
The bombardment.
This is before the cannon.
So are these random shots, or are they actually directed at them?
Well, some of this comes because of the Bliss farm.
Right.
In the morning. So there's cannonade action early in the morning, and some of it starts and they can't get it shut down, even though the commanders want to. Some of them want it shut down, but they can't. It gets extended. But there's a cannonade in the morning, and a lot of this has to do with the action out at the Bliss farm, which later gets burned.
Yeah,
all of Hill's AP Hill's guns, I think, at one point or another get drawn into that. All of the Second Corps guns are involved in that.
See, it's funny, if you go by the movie, it gives you an impression that everybody's having a picnic all day, and it's a very quiet morning, right? Everybody's too hot, too tired, and then all of a sudden, the heavens open and rains iron and lead. But so there's stuff going on all morning. We know about Culp's Hill, but you don't hear a lot about the center of the line getting some artillery before the official bombardment begins.
And like Zach said, the listeners and viewers should also know that when the stone wall comes down across the 69th Pennsylvania, which comes down in front of there, in Hall's position, there is a gate, a farmer's gate, that allows you to get in and out of that field that is now to the west of where that stone wall is, and that's the eye of the storm. So these regiments for Hall are going to be right there when the Confederates break through.
Yeah.
They break through about 2 or 3 places in that line. Down there at Rorty's Battery, which is south of that location, where this gate is located, up against where Cowan's guns eventually are going to get put there. Brown's there first. Yep. And then over the wall where the angle is. So you always hear about people stepping across the wall. Well, there's an opening, a gate, right here that Hall's men, where the 59th New York is located, where they're protecting, and they're going to be right in the middle of the Confederates coming right through there.
That's still there, the gate,
it
right?
Is. Yeah. It is still there.
Right behind the 59th New York.
Yeah. So, and it's an open space there with the barricades and breastworks being south, the stone wall. Yeah. And today, by the way, the stone wall doesn't, if you look at maps, the stone wall doesn't come across all the front of the 69th today. In the battle, it did.
It did. Okay.
The wall came all the way down to where that opening is.
Oh,
interesting. I think basically what the Union disposition looks like on that particular, and this we're talking about yardage and footage, right? But it's Gettysburg, so why the hell not?
Yeah.
I think basically the 69th New York line seems to stop just north of that gate, gap, and the 59th New York line picks up on the other side of that gap.
Okay.
There's a little bit of like a 5-yard, maybe not even that much gap between the two brigades.
But would they have left this gate open though?
Got it. Well, and we don't know what was torn out. We don't know if it was an actual. I don't think we know.
Well, I mean, an opening. We'll call it an opening.
There's an opening.
Yeah.
And that opening, a conglomeration of all the regiments. So this is going to be the right of Armstead. It's going to be part of Kemper, probably the right of Garnett. I mean, a bunch of people coming together are going to go through where that opening is on July 3rd. So if you're one of these regiments, you're going to have to be defending against all that.
And there's wood piled. I mean, like they tore down fences and built breastworks. There's probably some dirt thrown in there as well.
Rocks,
I think right. Anything they can get their hands on.
What I think is interesting, and Zach's probably seen it, but there on the old maps there's a wall that runs on the north side.
Oh yeah.
On the east side. It's a wall that would have gone from where the angle is. Yeah. Down along where the road is today, down to the copse of trees. So not the inner wall, but there's one that's actually shown on the maps later, and it makes you wonder whether they didn't take those rocks and put them down on the front wall.
Gotcha.
Because nobody mentions that.
Yeah.
And it really
so you're saying where the sidewalk is
where Arnold's
behind
Battery is.
Okay.
Where the angle of Arnold's Battery is.
Down.
There is on some of the maps. There's a wall shown heading south on what is now
sidewalk,
which is right now where that sidewalk
is.
But
even Dwayne's point about stone walls, if you look, there are walls perpendicular to
the
breastworks or the wall, so it makes you think also that they were taking some
I bet that's right. So because nobody's mentioned that, so I would bet money that on the evening of the 2nd and 3rd, these guys are taking all these walks.
Talking about
that makes sense though.
As long as we're talking about the topography, I think it's also worth mentioning that there's you have to go to the west side of it to see it.
Okay.
You have to go through the gate or the other sort of exit out of the breastworks, walk down toward, I think there's the brigade plaque for Wright's Brigade.
Yes.
If you turn around and look east, you can't see Hall's men.
Right.
There's
a knoll, there's a rock ledge. It's called the slashing on some maps because it was like scrub growth. It's basically a dump for the farmer. He dumped all his trash and trees and everything, and sapling growth, and there's everything, weeds growing up there. And it's a rock ledge. And so if you're the Confederates, and I know we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but if you're the Confederates and you get up to that position, it's very tough to see Hall's men.
Yeah.
So when you look at, for instance, the casualty returns for Hall's men, and Henry Abbott talks about this in his official report because he ends up filing the report for the regiment. He says, most of our guys, when they were hit by small arms fire, were hit in the upper body because we were protected by the rock ledge and the slashing.
Sure.
Most of the casualties in the brigade, and that includes guys in the 20th Massachusetts, the 7th Michigan, and the 59th New York, most of their casualties are artillery fire, either during the cannonade or at the very end of Pickett's charge, something we can get into. They're not small arms fire from Kemper or Garnett's men because of the slashing.
That's, you always talk about how, you got to walk the field of Pickett's charge because it's deceptively flat. When you stand at either end, you look out and you think it's just this flat field. That's your first lesson in it. All you have to do is go across that wall just a few yards and turn around and look at the wall, and you'll see the first deception revealed by that part, the slashing that you put. And also another point that you bring up there is because when I was reading last night, I saw there was a description in here of what the field looked like, and there were some trees out in the field where there's no trees today. Some of them had been, I guess, cut down or something, and so there were just stumps and things like that. We have to remember that the park is a park. It's idealized now, the way it looks. It represents a lot of things, but it's not the way it looked then. If it were to be really the way it looked then, you'd have cows all over the place. You'd have sheep, whatever.
Beavers.
Well, that's the way it looks now. But you would have life. It was these are people's farms. Contrary to a very popular question I hear you guides get a lot, why did these battles always happen in national parks? It didn't. The national park came later. So these were just regular farms, and it just so happened the armies had a battle here. So they would have had to deal with all of the trappings of fighting around farms. Yeah. And I guess that must be why we have the hogs eating guys down in the wheat field, because the hog pen got busted down and the hogs went free and down at the Rose Farm.
A lot of stuff roaming around. And we should also mention that the opposite is true from what Zack is saying, is the Confederates get some protection in these areas.
Yeah.
So while the Union Army gets protection, the Confederates also get, if you're hunkered down, if you get right up against that line, if you're up against where these little hillocks are, you get some sense of protection there. And we should say Hall,
I'm not moving.
Hall gets credit, if credit's the right word we want to use, probably for Hall's men probably get credit for wounding Kemper. Kemper is probably wounded by the men of Hall's brigade, and he's wounded right out in front of where that is, and people run out to get him. And the Confederates, they try to shoot down some bunch of people. Then the Confederates get him and end up taking him back. But he's shot down along a fence line that's probably in front of where the 20th Mass is.
He said he could see the guy, and he could see the guy's face who shot him.
Really?
These are Hall's men. Yeah. These would be Hall's men that would have probably Armstead and Garnett are probably taken out by Webb's men, probably in 69. But definitely Kemper taken out by probably by Hall's men. I
can't imagine that. Like seeing the face of the guy, especially with all the smoke and everything, and you're able to see this guy's face, and then he shoots you. Okay. So let's get into the fighting here now. We've given a little preview of Pickett's charge and everything, but let's start. So how do they fare during the bombardment? Do they take a lot of casualties then, or is it just basically a fireworks show?
Well, I think they get some casualties, as you mentioned. You've got some that are going to overshoot the line. Then they've got some friendly fire. You mentioned what happened to Ropes. That's a terrible story. That weighed heavy on a lot of the people.
Well, let's pause on that for a second, or let's sit on that for a second. Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned Cowan's Battery, and I believe it's Cowan's Battery I'm thinking of, that in front of where the battery is, they have no infantry so that they could fire. There's like a gap
kind of
in the line, is it right?
Yeah. Well, Cowan's brought up later. Brown to replace Brown. That's pretty much shot up.
Okay,
that's in there. And then Rorty's Battery is the one, and it's clear that there are troops in front of Rorty's Battery, at least for part of the time.
No, there are.
And that's there. But
well, there'd have to be.
I don't know. They're not supposed to be. They're not intended necessarily to fire canister over the heads of the troops, although they will.
And so
they're firing shot and shell over the heads of the troops, and the troops are lying prone in front of them.
Correct. They're not standing up. Right.
But some of them, I mean, there are a couple guys in Company G or Company K, the 69th Pennsylvania, that get decapitated by Cowan's fire. Yeah. It's not. It's not unheard of.
So that's what that's what I'm kind of getting at there is I know that they would lay down, but I also know that they didn't really like being in that position, the infantry.
Surprisingly not, no.
And I can't imagine why.
I don't know. We've got an infantry officer back. I mean, you think any infantry officer likes being underneath their own gun? The Union Army at least had fuses that were reliable enough to try to have this. The Confederates. There's no way you're going to be able to do that. So,
but didn't they have?
It doesn't mean guys got to like it, but at least the Union Army felt that they had fuses, and they did with a Borman fuse that would have been much more accurate to be able.
But didn't some of the rounds? And I'm not a big
or reliable is the word I'm using.
Right? Yeah. Go ahead. I'm not huge on all the artillery ordnance and different things, but didn't some of them, or maybe all of them, have lead sabots or however you pronounce that, that would detach and sometimes fall on the tree. Like, wasn't that one of the reasons they didn't like laying down in front of it, because they'd be getting hit with the lead? Is that right?
As far as I know.
Yeah. Depends. I mean, each of the rounds had some sort of, the Parrott usually had it on the back, the Schinkel had it around the shell. There's different types of things. And let's remember that these guns that we're mentioning, Zack and I are mentioning, a Brown is removed, so it's there.
And he has Napoleons.
And that's First Rhode Island Light Artillery Brown?
Battery B.
Battery B.
But the rest of these are rifle guns, which means they're used for longer range. So they are firing like in the cannonade, and you can use canister, but you're going to use it close by. You're not going to use it at the times that we're talking about here. You're fired against other artillery targets that are on there. And Rorty, of course, is killed. I mean, there's the casualties. I don't know if we can measure exactly what they are, but they do. These guys sustain casualties definitely in the cannonade.
You would have
no question about it.
What a messy place to be in, too. I mean, during that cannonade, because I think a lot of people think, well, the Reb artillery overshot, so everybody was okay.
Well, some of it did, but there's a phenomenal account. One of the things about this brigade that's really interesting, I think, is that you get so many officer accounts from this brigade. But very few really good, reliable, I would say enlisted men accounts from this brigade. One of the best, and it's never been published, but the Park has it in their library, is the extensive collection of a soldier in the 59th New York. He was in Company B. He was originally in Company H, and Company H was an Ohio company in 59th New York, right?
Yeah, right.
they were a Buckeye company that just so happened to get sent to New York to sort of fit out the regiment when they were mustered in. And he leaves behind this very extensive letter collection all through the war, including post-war reminiscences, sort of reflecting on things. And he talks about the cannonade. And he says our guys were basically like lying down, sort of looking up with their heads against the stone wall or the rails or something, in taking cover. And he said it was a percussion shell, and they could tell because it detonates on impact. He said a percussion shell slammed right into the breastworks of Company B of the 59th New York and took out several men, including his messmate. He said Sergeant Jim Martin, and Martin, he said, eventually died later that night. He sat up with him until he died. He died underneath an apple tree behind Cemetery Ridge. The guy said, according to his pension file, because I looked at the pension file, and the captain who ended up commanding the regiment, Captain William McFadden, said that the last thing Martin said, he wanted to be known that he died a Union Democrat. So it just sort of shows you, I think, not just the sacrifice these guys
to the end,
but this is part of who they are.
Yeah,
they die.
Yeah.
So they do suffer during the bombardment. They actually do.
But they'd have to, right?
No question. We know Cushing's
batteries all but taken out.
I mean, because the target for those Confederate artillerists, that's going to be counter battery fire. And the Union Army, the guys that are along there, if you can get collateral damage, great for you. If you're a Confederate, bad for you if you happen to be the Union. But they're shooting at that old artillery. Cushing, we know one of the limber chests, something goes in there and blows up like three different limber chests. It's bad. It's bad.
I think there's one account of I think it was a solid shot going through 6 horses that were side by side.
Yeah.
I mean, just
I can't even imagine.
I mean, just the mess that would have made.
So one thing we can tell the listeners and the viewers is that it's when you hear the accounts that the cannonade didn't do damage.
Right.
We need to put that to rest.
Yeah.
That's key.
It didn't achieve
the goal,
operational goal for Lee there, which was to silence the artillery, kill infantrymen. Make sure you could try to open that up for the infantry to attack. but that it didn't do damage is not a correct thing.
It did a hell of a lot of damage.
We need to make sure we put that sort of bed, because I think some people say, well, it didn't, it didn't meet the operational objectives that Lee had in his mind carved out for it.
Right.
That doesn't mean that it didn't do damage.
Right. It harmed them for sure. Yeah. Have you read Our Story by Stephen Evangelista about Battery B, 1st Rhode Island Light Artillery?
No, I haven't read it. I don't think I've read it.
It's good because every chapter is a different man's biography. And
when did that come out?
A couple years ago.
Oh, is it new? Okay.
Yeah, I have it out there. I'll let you borrow it if you want. But it's really good because it's just the biographies of the men of the battery and if they died, how they died, and but some of the guys that died, the story, in the bombardment or Wright's or earlier on, it's just horrible. Nasty ways of going.
So if you're in Hall's Brigade, think about that. These are your friends dying.
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah,
and now you're going to have to face those men from Pickett's division coming forward. So you just saw all your friends basically get killed, and now you're going to have to, or some of your friends get killed. Now you're going to have to repulse that.
Yeah.
So psychologically, what's going through your head when that? And one of my favorite officers in the brigade, we talked about Henry Livermore Abbott, who's at Gettysburg. He's a captain here, later a major. But Sumner Payne, Sumner Payne is an officer in the 20th Mass, and he's 17. And he's buried in the National Cemetery. He's killed at Gettysburg, and he's just 17 years old. He's going to command a group of troops. As an officer, he would have commanded probably a platoon of 47 men. He's 17 years old.
Yeah. Jesus, makes me feel like a loser.
Yeah.
So, lieutenant at 17, I barely rubbed two pennies together.
His first action was at Chancellorsville, and I think his company commander, I think it was the same company that the Supreme Court justice just went out of my mind. Holmes was company commander, wounded there. That's why Holmes wasn't at Gettysburg.
Holmes got shot in every battle.
Really?
That's why he wasn't at Gettysburg.
Yeah.
Okay.
He suffered a very painful wound at Second.
He gets wounded at the Second Fredericksburg. But anyway, I think the first action for this young officer is there, and he takes over command when Holmes is wounded, I believe.
It's unbelievable.
17 years old.
What's unbelievable to me is that anybody over 17 would take an order from a lieutenant who's 17 years old, lieutenant or not.
Since we're on the topic of age, I just wanted to throw out there. I looked up how old these regimental commanders.
Yeah, how old?
That's good.
Paul is what did I say?
26.
26.
Yeah.
Okay.
Devereaux's young.
Arthur Devereaux, commanding the 19th Massachusetts, is 25.
25.
All right.
Really?
Edmund Rice, the major of the regiment, is 20.
Yeah.
Paul Revere, grandson of
he's
the Midnight
like
Rider,
100 by that point.
20th Massachusetts. Grandson of Paul Revere, Paul Joseph Revere, commands 20th Massachusetts. He's 30. Okay, so he's
the old guy.
Yeah.
7th Michigan, Amos Steele is 29. Okay. He'll die during Pickett's charge. James Mallon, commanding the 42nd New York, is 26.
And Mallon dies like at Mine Run. Mallon's killed after
dies
Gettysburg.
at Bristow Station.
Bristow Station. All right. So he dies after Gettysburg.
Initially commanding the 59th New York, we didn't talk about him, but I should maybe during Q&A's because he's a fascinating guy. Max Tomman is 33.
Tomman's almost like a mercenary, right?
He is a mercenary. He's literally the Dos Equis guy. He's the most interesting man in the world. So don't let me end this without talking about it.
As soon as you said his name, it rang a bell, but I can't remember why.
He's the old guy in the brigade, and he's 33.
Wow. And that. Yeah. Just hearing that is, Hollywood really screws with your way to, the way we imagine things. Because high
schoolers are always 35, and
exactly, and 30-year-olds are always 70. Yeah. Like these guys would have been old men if they depicted them in Hollywood.
Yeah,
and the movie Gettysburg.
Some of them, like George Meade, already look like they're 70, though.
Yeah. Right, but he was, 47?
Yeah, he's like 46, 47,
right.
I think.
So, but he looks like an old man. Yeah. And now, it is a stressful life.
I've seen a picture of Tomman, and Tomman does not look necessarily like a young man.
No, I'm sure none of them did, really. Have you seen pictures of Hall and other guys?
There are one or two pictures of Hall.
Are they clear? And you can see. Are they findable online?
Yeah, you can find a good picture.
Okay, good. I'll look him up here. Norman J. Hall. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there he is.
Webb, and of course, even if you go outside there, Webb's like 28. I mean, Webb was born in 1835, so these are younger men.
And I think some of them look younger. Like the guys in the 20th Massachusetts, Abbott, and some of these guys. They are some of the only guys in the Civil War you will ever see who don't have facial hair. I mean, it's not their thing. Like Barlow, another one of these like New England patrician guys, just like Abbott, just like Shaw, just like Holmes.
Yep.
They go through hell during the war, but it's like they keep putting themselves through hell.
You mean just to stay clean shaven?
No, I'm just saying, like they every time they get hit, they keep coming back.
Oh yeah.
But there's something about like they stand out. They don't need the facial hair to show what how cool they are or something like that. So they look kind of younger.
Right.
Like Barlow looks like he's 17.
He does, yeah. And Shaw does too.
Yeah.
Yeah. They both. Yeah. No, you're right.
Yeah.
Okay. So bombardment, it ends. Now it's time for the infantry to come across, and they come across. So now, most of Hall's brigade would it be correct to say the right of the brigade is maybe like midway in the copse of trees, and then to the left, if
a little bit farther south,
so they're a little so the right is resting.
I think
south of the copse of trees,
pretty much at the gate that Wayne mentioned. I think this is my personal opinion. Again, we're talking about footage and yardage, but it's Gettysburg, so why not?
Pull the mic closer to you.
I think the right of the brigade is where the gate is. I think their left is a little bit farther south than the 20th Massachusetts monument.
All right, so I'm just giving
because those monuments were moved.
Just giving that's right. Okay, so just to give people an idea where we're talking, don't picture the angle itself. Picture south of it there, the part that you never walk down to, in front of the U.S. Regulars monument.
And if you do, what's very interesting about this is if you're back where the 19th and 42nd are, and we know we've got some accounts, we'll probably talk about it, but they're not seeing anything until the Confederates break through those trees. If you're down there and look to the right, you can't see. You're not seeing up where that area is. Right where the copse of trees is, that goes up a little ways. It's like a little hill.
Yeah.
So you don't see a thing until those guys, and that's why Devereaux and these guys are saying, "Hey, look, we better get in there," because Hancock rides down the line. It's a pretty famous story, and he says, "Look, those guys are breaking through." He's seeing the Confederates coming through. Almost where the cops breaking the right of the 69th. And coming up against where that line is.
Okay, all right.
Pretty fascinating when you look. The terrain there means a lot.
It does.
Now, if you're in the front row, you can look up and see that. But if you're if you can see through the smoke and all the confusion and everything else, let's imagine that. But if you're in that second line,
but that's such a great point, though. With any of these actions that we talk about on the show or anywhere else you hear, you always have to remember, like, you got to go to the ground and see what they could see.
Right.
Because it's one thing to look at a map, which is a flat thing on a flat page, and even if it's got the topographical lines on it and everything, you really don't know what that means when you're on the ground. You got to go there and you got to see what the sight lines were, and that's how a lot of things are just based on what you have, the knowledge that you have at the time, and part of the knowledge you have is what you can see. So it's very important that I think you point that out. Okay, all right. So now, infantry comes on over. Take it away.
Well, Hall says he reserves his fire until the Confederates get within. I think he said that the 20th Massachusetts he reserves it for 200 yards, and then the 7th Michigan and the 59th New York, it's 100 yards or something like that. Some of the men in the brigade say it's even closer than that.
And given that Emmitsburg Road diverges at that point, that's on this side, that's on the east side of the road. Mm-hmm. When you're standing in front of the angle, the road is at a different amount because the road diverges right there.
Yeah. So if you're in the 7th Michigan and the 59th New York and you're kind of on the right end of Hall's line, I think we're talking about when the Confederates reach that knoll where Brown's battery had been the day before, where Brown's little marker is out there, when the Confederates reach that knoll and start descending it toward the Union battle line, I think is when Hall's brigade, for the most part, opens fire. Pretty close. Because otherwise, they're gonna get lost on the other side of the slashing. In fact, a lot of Confederates, especially probably Kemper's left wing, will crawl out there and try to take cover.
What do you think the discipline of Hall's men? I think it must have been superior to think about them looking at thousands. They're looking at thousands of gray uniforms, looking at that, saying to themselves, "Holy crap!" And the only thing they want to do is shoot people down.
And the thing about
it, they've got orders not to. Orders not to do that.
Hall writes about this in his
terrific discipline of troops.
Really.
His report. Hall's brigade report is really exceptional. I say that and I can't find it.
Once again, these guys being literate, like it's what you mentioned about a lot of these guys in the brigade, very literate.
Hall provides a fascinating diagram in his report. That's one of the best sources for what the Union perspective of Pickett's charge in terms of the movements and the obliques and everything actually looks like.
Can you find that online?
Page 458. Page 458.
Oh, my goodness.
On Volume 27, Part 1.
Oh, you got it here. Okay.
The reports, page 458. And why do I know that, Zach? Because what you're saying.
You know that?
Because it shows the flanking maneuver of Pickett's division.
It does.
So when a lot of people talk about how Pickett's men moved at a 45-degree angle, some of them did, but most of them, especially Kemper's men, moved at 90 degrees. Yeah. And this shows a 90-degree movement of those troops, right?
And move
correct.
North.
So that drawing is one of the best drawings, and you mentioned it. And I'm glad you brought it up because it's perfect. And I only know it because I'm very interested in it because it shows when people talk about how Pickett's men move from the Union perspective, that shows exactly how they move. Not only do we have a Confederate account.
This part here with the arrows.
Yes. They're moving at a 90-degree angle. Not at a 45-degree. You see that?
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
But I think the larger point is here that from the perspective of most of Hall's men who are hunkered down behind that breastwork, they're not really seeing Pickett's men until they come through the Kadori farm.
Right.
That's kind of the sense that I get, and I think if you go out there and walk it, I was here for the 150th. I'm sure you gentlemen were as well.
I was not.
You were not?
No.
Why? So you had the option. You could walk Pickett's charge, or you could be one of the good guys and watch. And so I stayed there with Hall's brigade and watched them come across, and it was fascinating because Pettigrew's command you can see the whole way for the most part.
Right.
Topography's changed maybe a little bit. Pickett's line, it's like they just come out of nowhere.
Right.
Really?
When they hit the Kadori farm.
See, I wish I had been
because
there
there's a ridge there, and then they have to come over it.
Yeah.
Where that is, and they come down into a lower part and up over that that is.
Well, and they start out of view too, so then all of a sudden they just appear.
That's what I'm really talking about. Yeah. They're sheltered.
Yeah.
But this diagram is, as Zach has brought it up, and it's great. One of the best in the official records for what it is.
Something interesting here, though, is I'm assuming this is the angle that we're talking. Okay,
that's what he's trying to.
So he has it. There's no stone wall where there's a stone wall now. He just has a rail fence, and right around where Arnold's battery is where the stone wall seems to start. So was it not a stone wall then?
No, it probably had a fence rider.
Yeah, a rider fence.
Probably had a rider fence.
Okay, so it was both.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
No, in fact, I think if you look at the Tipton photograph from the 1880s, I think it's a rider fence.
Yeah. Now the question is, how many of the perpendicular fences did the soldiers carry off and put somewhere else? How about the other? What did they build up on that?
Oh yeah,
there's clearly a wall in front of where the 69th is. Clearly, where part of the 72nd is located.
The Hall's men mostly have rails and earth.
Okay,
and then you've got the guys that are in the front line. But once those guys strike that and break through, it looks like the right flank of the 69th collapses. And the next thing you know, these guys are in the rear line. They, luckily for the Union, they're coming up there to try to close that gap off.
Right.
The 71st PA collapses.
Yeah.
Or at least they're headed back for better cover at the top of the hill, maybe for the reverse slope.
Isn't there someone in Hall's brigade who has a nice critical word for them too? I can't remember who it was or what they said, but it was something like.
Yeah.
This wasn't unusual for them or something.
And the 72nd is, one of the problems there, I think, is that Webb only gets command of that brigade a very short time before the battle.
Right.
And he replaces one of the other brigade commanders who had some issues, Patty Owen.
Yep.
And so Webb isn't known. And he talks about in the testimony of the 72nd, he grabbed a hold of the color bearer of the 72nd Pennsylvania, tried to pull him forward.
Yeah.
And they wonder, well, who's this guy?
Right.
And then unfortunately, the color bearer gets shot down. So there's some issues there. You think a general asks you to go forward, you probably try to go forward.
And I don't. We shouldn't, denigrate the Philadelphia Brigade. They're phenomenal. They're a phenomenal unit. They've had a lot of combat experience and some very good commanders. 69th Pennsylvania between Dennis O'Kane and Martin Chuddy. They are superb combat commanders.
They lose a lot of people too.
They do, but Webb, if I remember correctly, Webb, even in his report or in some letter he writes after the war, says his heart sank when he saw the 71st break and the 72nd wouldn't go forward, and he thanked Hall profusely for coming to his aid.
Yeah, okay.
And once again,
and who does he send to his aid?
Hall sends everybody.
Sends the whole brigade.
Everybody.
What's interesting is that Webb had been an artillery inspector, and guess what corps? 5th Corps, Meade's Corps. Mm-hmm. So when they need somebody to shore up the discipline in that unit, who do they send?
Okay.
They tap him. So I don't know how much was known, but it's probably that Meade probably knew him. Knew his reputation.
He's a
in the
Meade
Army.
acolyte. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Evan
Meade.
You want to make sure you send somebody over there to that's going to try to shore up that discipline, and that seems to be a problem in this unit.
There comes a point when the Confederates break through the line, and we tend to think that it was just Armistead and a couple of hundred guys right there at the angle, but there were a couple of other points where Confederates had broken through.
Right.
At some point, any sense of order kind of just dissolves. And now it's kind of every man for himself. Some guys, just mob together 5 or 6 deep, trying to shoot, pushing each other out of the way to shoot it at Confederates and everything. And it just turns into a street brawl, but it sounds like, to me, it sounded like something out of Gangs of New York from what I was reading.
Kind of.
And
I think it starts either at Emmitsburg Road or just or just east of Emmitsburg Road, because you got all that infantry and canister fire. I mean, the troops are getting shot at with infantry fire when they get to the road or just east of it. Not really before, unless they're hit by the skirmishers. That combined fire, that's going to turn this into what you're describing. Basically.
That's a great point, though, that, especially for people who are new to this. And the movie does a kind of good job at showing you this, but not really the result. And, how many men would you say from, let's say, the Bryan Farm buildings down to the left of, let's say, down to Harrow's brigade's position? How many men would you say are in there, on the line and in the second line, in reserve?
For the Union?
For the Union, yeah, sorry.
I don't know. What do you think the whole defense is? I mean,
3,000?
3,000, 5,000, something like that, a few thousand?
That'd be pretty big.
Because Hall has fewer than 900, considering he's lost men on July 2nd. I assume the Philadelphia Brigade has a bit more than that. But
you're counting Hayes, too.
Yes,
right?
correct.
Hayes, and then Hayes' division.
Yeah.
Hayes' division's a little bit bigger.
But the problem
so the number I have is 5,000-ish. There's got about 5,000.
But we don't know what they lost on the second. The problem is,
that's true.
Brigades lost stuff on the second we don't know. With all the artillery and with everybody there from down where McGilvery's line is up, I usually say 6,000, 5 to 6. But that's, we don't know how many of these people lost. Now, some of these are small. That counts for First Corps.
That's true. Good point. Yes. There's some Third Corps guys there too.
Well, they are, but we don't know what time they get up there. That's another problem. So the 99th Pennsylvania comes up.
Yeah.
But you can't. It's hard to really tell. Is it after one of them describes that the line is wrecked, and it could be wrecked because of the cannonade.
Okay.
So did they actually come up? It's hard to tell when they actually got there. Did they get up there before the repulse, or did they get there actually after the repulse? They could have got up there between the cannonade and the repulse, and it still looked wrecked.
It all happened really fast.
You know what I mean? It's all your vision. It's all your vision of it.
But now, all right. So
I think if you count everybody all in, you probably have a number bigger than what we're thinking of.
Probably.
If you count First Corps, you count part of Third, but not all those are actively engaged in the repulse, or we don't know how active they are.
Right, and that's why I picked Bryan down to Harrow there. Okay, so now let's I mean, we know, for example, like the 1st Minnesota has got, 40 guys, maybe 100 guys from the guys that came back?
They had 2 companies that came back, so they're there. Yeah.
So you have like around 100 guys.
There's not many.
So there's not a lot. So there could be. And now flip to the other side, we've always heard 15,000 Confederates, but when in reality, when you think of it, it's probably closer to 10. When you consider that what Pettigrew and Trimble's divisions had to go through on the 1st and the losses they had, it may be 10 or 12,000.
When Jim and I did our work, we settled on, we did 12,000.
Okay, 12,000.
But you also, are you counting the artillerists? I mean, they're not in
no,
the band,
just infantry. I'm trying to get to
Wilcox and Lang.
What about Wilcox?
You got to count Wilcox and Lang, which is the right, the supports for Pickett.
Okay.
They come from Anderson. So you've got 4 divisions in what we call Longstreet's assault,
right.
not 3.
Right.
You actually got 4, and you've got Wilcox and Lang that are there too. Now they lost on the 2nd, but they're there. So it's
but they're they're on the periphery of this fight, aren't they? I mean, they're not. I guess I'm not.
Perspective, yes.
Yes,
from their perspective, of course.
Of course not. Yeah.
But from our perspective,
but no. But what I'm getting at is I'm just talking about that because you mentioned the Emmitsburg Road as soon as they cross over the Emmitsburg Road, right? So the Emmitsburg Road from the stone wall from Hall's position, the Emmitsburg Road, not very far. Was that 1, maybe 2 football fields, 3, something like that? Not very far. Musket range is my point. Okay. Musket range, canister. They were already in canister range before they crossed the Emmitsburg Road.
Right.
And now let's say let's go with the number 5,000 on the conservative side. We have 5,000 muskets that get up and fire down this line at these guys who are caught up on fences, right? Like they're crossing fences or they're funneling through gaps in fences. And then they get out into this killing field in front of them. It's a wonder that anybody survived and got across the wall.
But it's a mob. You got people in front, and you got everybody in the back.
Yeah,
so it's a mob. And Jim and I, we just had a conversation. Jim Hessler and I, my co-author, we just had a talk about this, about crossing the Emmitsburg Road and how many people do we think got across it, because that's been a huge debate recently. Is that everybody stayed in the road, which I don't believe at all, because if you look at the bodies that are buried, they're buried on the east side of the road. You don't drag a body from the west side of the road over the east side of the road. Look at the LA burial map. In my view,
550 of them buried right
clearly
there.
The majority of the Confederates got out of that road. In my view, got out of the road, got somewhere up in the middle of that, and then the infantry fire probably drove them back down into the road. But it doesn't mean they didn't get out of the road.
Right. Yeah.
And I think there tends to be everybody thinking, and some of the reports probably, given the closest, if Hall says that his men didn't, he fired some at 200 yards and he fired some at 100 yards. Those are men that are out of the road. They're not in the road.
Right.
Yeah, and that's pretty. That seems to be pretty standard for Civil War combat. We think about Civil War combat, because of the rifle musket, they could fire at 400 yards. They didn't. Hardly ever is Civil War combat conducted at that distance. Right. It's usually about Napoleonic style. I mean, it's 100 to 150 yards.
Yeah,
that's pretty normal.
Jesus.
And on a smokeless, on a battlefield that has smoke, not on without smokeless gunpowder.
Yeah,
you can't see much. So you have to factor in a lot of things into this.
Sure.
A couple points about the firepower aspect of this is the 7th Michigan, the 59th New York fought Wright the night before. Mm-hmm. They went out into the field and collected as many muskets as they could and had them loaded and ready to go. 69 Pennsylvania did the same.
So
once they started firing, they didn't have to stop again for a couple minutes.
Yeah.
And then the 7th Michigan makes it quite clear in their accounts, again, official records and other officer accounts primarily, they're issuing the order to fix bayonets as the Confederates get closer. So that's a bad day when you get the order to fix bayonets. There's an indication that this is going to go hand to hand. And in fact, men of the 7th Michigan and the 59th New York say that this is some of the only hand-to-hand fighting they ever had in the war. 7th Michigan said they crossed, bayonets with these guys. 59th New York, they said some of our guys got stepped on by Confederates as they were headed for Cowan's Battery. Another guy from the 59th New York got a couple different accounts of this, say that as he'd been firing his musket so rapidly, the thing fouled, right? After 10 or 15 rounds, he was not going to be able to ram the ball home anymore. got so pissed off he bent the ramrod over his knee, threw it at the Confederates, and picked up rocks and started chucking them at the Virginians. Right? So there is a hand-to-hand aspect to this that is very unusual for Civil War combat.
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories for this brigade is one of the Medals of Honor that was given, and the 19th Mass got 5 of them at Gettysburg, is that when the troops of the 19th Mass went through the copse of trees. So they're at the south end of the copse of trees. The Confederates are breaking through. They start to turn and head north, and Arthur Devereaux, the current commanding officer, leads them through there. Rice is right there with him. And the color bearer of the 19th Mass, carrying the white Massachusetts flag, Joseph DeCastro, he comes face to face on the north side of the copse of trees with the color bearer of the 14th Virginia. They're standing right next to each other. And he crosses staves with him, knocks him down, grabs the flag, and pulls it right out of his hand. Actually does that in combat. That's not a flag lying on one of the cannons.
Right.
He actually takes it out of the Confederate color bearer's hand and gets a Medal of Honor for that. And he's the first Hispanic Medal of Honor recipient in the history of the United States.
Oh, really?
His father was born in Spain, and he's like 18 at Gettysburg.
What was his name?
His name is Joseph DeCastro.
DeCastro. Okay.
And he the OR, or and Zack will tell you, there's some problems with what flag he gets credited to. The citation says he's credited, I think, for the 19th Virginia. He actually captures the flag of the 14th Virginia.
Okay.
And that's in the records. And that flag is in a private collection today. That is not in the American Civil War Museum, which used to be in the Museum of the Confederacy. That's not. That's in a private collection. But Joseph DeCastro, first Hispanic American
That's pretty cool.
to get the Medal of Honor, and he got it by crossing staves in the middle of combat.
Jesus.
In Pickett's charge, taking the flag.
So I mean that whole aspect of the movie where there's scuffle inside the angle, that's not fiction. There is hand-to-hand combat in Pickett's charge. There's hand-to-hand combat with the 69th Pennsylvania when they start to not get overrun, but start to deal with what's in front of them. And there's hand-to-hand combat to the left of the 69th where the 59th and the 7th are. There's hand-to-hand combat up in the trees when the 19th Massachusetts and the 42nd New York.
And the 72nd Pennsylvania wants you to know that, because when they put their monument up, what is it?
Yeah, yeah, the guy with the club musket. Yeah.
Now, does it happen often in the war? No, but clearly in this case, it happened.
But again, speaking to that, one of the things that really comes through in the accounts from Hall's brigade is that when they get up into the trees, and eventually all of them are going to get up there. First, the 19th and the 42nd are sent up there, or send themselves up there, basically. But Hancock says, get in there as fast as you can. But then eventually when the 59th and the 7th Michigan and then the 20th Massachusetts start running up to the copse of trees because their targets are disappearing. They're starting to head up. The Virginians themselves are starting to charge up in that direction. When there's this scuffle, when there's this melee, the Confederates open fire with artillery again for a couple minutes. And maybe it's some of Alexander's guns in the Peach Orchard. Maybe it's some of those handful of guns that Alexander has been able to send forward, because he said he went from gun to gun. If they had enough ammunition, he sent them forward. Regardless, in the middle of all that scuffle, there's shells bursting in the middle of the copse of trees and everything around that. So a lot of these guys in the 20th Massachusetts and some of them in the 59th New York as well, when they're wounded by artillery fire, they're not necessarily wounded during the cannonade. Henry Abbott and others say they're wounded during this brief, bombardment of the hand-to-hand fight that happened.
But that also means the Confederates are getting wounded by it, too.
Exactly.
So they're firing on their own men.
God
damn it.
And there's probably, I don't know, Jim and I, when we wrote our little study on Pickett's charge, we tried to come up with how many guns. There's at least 15 probably that did go forward for Pickett. That had enough ammunition, the types that they wanted to try to push forward to support the attack. Probably 15 guns.
So maybe they're the ones that are firing.
Those howitzers that are over behind the Virginia Memorial, did they go forward?
They're not found. They send
Pendleton had moved them, right?
And Alexander's not happy, of course, by that. He sends something back to get them, and they can't hardly find
them. Oh, really?
So they got problems finding them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So and that's another thing that's not often talked about is that there was a plan after the bombardment to follow the infantry with guns.
Right.
And would they have had guns limbered up and ready to go waiting, or would they limber the guns that took part in the bombardment and move them forward, or both?
Alexander says that he, at least for the 1st Corps Artillery, I don't know about the 3rd Corps Artillery, and it doesn't look like there's hardly any from A.P. Hill's Corps because they had such a distance to go, but Alexander says he rode down the line to check the limbers and the ammunition chest. And if it had so many in the limber chest, then he said this ought to be a unit to go forward.
Okay.
Because they had exhausted a lot of the long-range ammunition. And in the many accounts he has of Pickett's charge, of which there are many, he's got an account of battles and leaders. He's got the book that he wrote. Then he's got Fighting for the Confederacy, which was edited by Gary Gallagher. There's multiple things. And he varies a little bit on each one of those, 12 to 15, 12.
Okay.
I tried to go through and calculate what are the ones we know. Is there any reports for ones that we know? And it looks maybe 15 guns. Okay. But it seems to indicate that was not planned which guns were to go forward first. They hoped a lot of them would go forward. The cannonade extended the amount of ammunition that was expended, and then he has to ride down. He rides down to say, okay, you look like you got enough, go. Okay. And he gives a number. I forget what that is, like 20 foot drive. He gives a number as to how many he fixed in his mind.
Right.
That he would say, okay, you got that much, go.
Okay.
You don't go.
So there you go, people. You just have to get your book.
Seems to
Wayne and Jim's book.
Well, we put it in there. It's very controversial because a lot of people want to know, but we did try to work out. And the primary accounts for the Confederate artillery are, almost non-existent.
Yeah, that's the hard part, right?
At least with the infantry accounts, as Zack has been quoting here, we've got good letters. You've got so many more people involved that you've got a chance. In our Confederate artillery battery, you got 100 guys.
Right.
So you've got a tenth of what you've got, at least for the start of the infantry. So trying to find, especially enlisted accounts, really tough. Mm-hmm. So for the Confederate artillery at Gettysburg, mostly what we have, if they had a report at whatever the level is, it's most of what we have. We don't have much more than that.
All right, so wrap up the Battle of Gettysburg and Hall's brigade for us. Then we'll take a break and go take the questions.
Well, Hall's brigade does about as well as I think any brigade in the Union Army, at least in terms of helping to repulse Pickett's charge. Like I said, I think Webb shared a lot of the credit in his writings after the war with Hall. It's unfortunate that Hall died as early as he did. I think otherwise we would have had a much stronger record of what his brigade actually accomplished. But they are the ones who charge into the copse of trees and help repulse the Confederates. And I think they do about as well as any Union brigade can do, given the circumstances. It's a tough fight. It's an exhausting fight. It's a fight that probably takes out about 40% of Hall's brigade and exhausts him physically in the process. He is pretty much falling down, exhausted at the end of this fight. And it's worth mentioning as well. Is that I forgot to mention it earlier. Hall loses 3 of 5 regimental commanders here at Gettysburg. He loses Paul Joseph Revere on the evening of July 2nd. He loses Max Tomman, who again we need to come back to, on the evening of July 2nd, and he loses Steele, Amos Steele, the 7th Michigan, on the afternoon of July 3rd. Yeah. So 3 out of 5 regimental commanders are killed or mortally wounded as well.
Does Hall remain in command of the brigade for the remainder of the war?
Hall is going to command the brigade during some of the pursuit of Lee's army, but it's pretty clear that he's not in good shape. He will, I believe, he goes back he goes into Georgetown General Hospital back in D.C. During the pursuit to try to recuperate. Then he's sent back for recruiting duty in Michigan in the fall of 1863. He keeps trying to come back to the front. It's where his heart is, really, but he never makes it. He gets as far as D.C. one time before he suffers another attack of typhoid or whatever it is that's ailing him. He's subjected to some sort of operation. I'm not exactly sure what the operation is. Perhaps he was having a lot of intestinal inflammation and everything. I don't know if it had something to do with that. But he will never, as far as I know, he will never command troops in combat again after Gettysburg.
It could be another reason why he's also not getting that promotion. They can't put him back into the field again. No. And since he can't, they want somebody that can go out in the field. That's going to be.
He'll get promoted in the regular Army to captain.
Yeah. And that's a big deal, by the way.
It is.
We should tell everybody that this guy graduates, as a second lieutenant. Promotion in the regular Army, very slow.
Very slow.
So when the war ends, he's going to go back to being a captain. And by the way, that's the rank that Custer reverted to. Let's remember,
exactly.
Let's remember that. So for him to get that for his career, if he could stay, if he was well enough, that was a big deal. No question.
And then died in 1867. Left behind a loving wife and 2 sons. And is now buried at the United States Military Academy.
And if you go to the Monroe Museum, we should tell everybody, when they go to the public museum in Monroe, not only do they have Custer stuff there, they got stuff that belongs to Norman Hall.
Oh, yeah?
His stuff, like his uniform, I've seen it, and it's interesting stuff. So, and if you contact some of the folks at the round table, they actually know, at least one of the guys knows where Hall lived, so you could see that. So we want to give a shout out to the folks in Monroe County.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Monroe County Public Museum. Not only everybody goes to see Custer,
of course,
but let me say that Hall.
Not me. I'm going to Monroe to see Hall.
There you go.
I don't care about
Norman Hall has got materials there, and
I'd like to go see both.
Yeah, I also want to say that Fallen Leaves, which Zack has brought this. Edited by Robert Gar Scott, Fallen Leaves, the letters of Henry Livermore Abbott, one of the best letter collections out of Hall's Brigade. Yeah. You can buy this book used. You can go online and get it. And one thing I like about it is what you're mentioning about what happened, the aftermath of this. These guys are haunted by what happened here, the loss of their friends, and you can read that. In here when Henry Livermore Abbott talks about ropes and what he meant to there and some of their pain and some of these people we've talked about. So psychologically devastating, not just physically.
Yeah.
The men of the brigade there. So got to give a shout out for Fallen Leaves because Zack and I, it's one of our favorite, probably my favorite Civil War book, one of the favorite Civil War books of yours. Just a great collection of letters.
All right, very good. Then we're going to give a shout out to our beloved sponsors, and we'll take a break and be back right after these words with questions from our patrons. The Gettysburg Museum of History, located right here in the center of Gettysburg, PA. Owner and curator Eric Dorr grew up here and has spent his life collecting and preserving history through artifacts ranging from the Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg, World War II, presidential items, pop culture, and more. His museum is free and open to visitors Wednesday through Sunday, 11 to 5 p.m., where you can stop by and immerse yourself in some of the most amazing artifacts that you would never believe exist in the middle of Gettysburg. If you're a fan of Band of Brothers and Everything Easy Company, you'll love his exhibit featuring the Dick Winters collection and artifacts from D-Day. You can even own your own piece of history by buying one of the many relics they have for sale in the museum and on the website GettysburgMuseumofHistory.com. The Gettysburg Museum of History is a non-profit 501c3 organization with a foundation that allows all purchases and donations to keep the museum operating and open free of charge. They have been featured on the History Channel, the Travel Channel, the Smithsonian Channel, and the Science Channel. Now you can check them out on American Artifact, the series on the YouTube channel, The History Underground. So that's the Gettysburg Museum of History at 219 Baltimore Street or the GettysburgMuseumofHistory.com.
Who can forget the sounds of the 60s?
The 1860s. I can't, and you can't either. Now, there's Marching Through Georgia, the exciting new album by Billy Webster. All of your favorite hits of the 1860s in one place. Such hits as Gary Owens, The Battle Hymn of the Republic, All Quiet Along the Potomac Tonight, Marching Through Georgia, and much, much more. So what are you waiting for? Go to billysongs.com and order your digital download of Billy Webster's Marching Through Georgia today. That's billysongs.com. Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center, Gettysburg's premier museum, is housed in the historic Lutheran Seminary building constructed in 1832, a witness to the first day of battle. The museum's 3 floors of exhibits connect visitors to the dilemmas that led to the Civil War, provide a powerful and personal view of the battle's first day, and explore one of the battlefield's largest hospitals. No visit to Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center is complete without a guided tour of the building's famous cupola, where on the eve of battle, officers and civilians saw thousands of Confederate soldiers' campfires burning to the west, and Brigadier General John Buford watched for vital federal reinforcements as fighting erupted on the morning of July 1st. Today, you can stand where Buford stood and discover how this view helped chart the course of the Battle of Gettysburg. Your trip to Gettysburg is not complete without a serious visit to Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center, Gettysburg's premier museum. Purchase tickets online at seminaryridgemuseum.org or call 717-339-1300. To get tickets or a cupola tour, listeners may call or walk in and mention addressing Gettysburg, or by ordering online using the promo code AG1863 for 20% off. Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. It began here.
There's a devil to pay.
If you're a lover of history, then go to trhistorical.com. There you'll find apparel, drinkware, decor, and more featuring a wide range of interests from the ancient world to the Cold War. Looking to make an impression with the perfect gift? Well, TR Historical now offers gift cards and a vintage wrapping service for a truly unique presentation. And our listeners will receive 10% off plus free shipping in the U.S. when you use promo code GBERG1863. So go to trhistorical.com, TR Historical, for the love of history.
You've heard us promote various ways that you can help us keep the show going, but one way we haven't pushed too much is our sutlery at addressinggettysburg.com/shop. That's a shame because we have designs over there by talented artists like Ty DeWitt of 1863 Designs and Mike Stretch of the Heritage Depot. So now we're promoting it. Buying shirts, hoodies, mugs, and other items from our sutlery not only helps us keep the lights on, but it also helps guys like Ty and Mike, and it helps spread the word about the show every time you wear an item or you sip from your mug. So head over to addressinggettysburg.com/shop and grab some merch. It's the perfect Christmas gift for the Gettys nerd in your family. That's addressinggettysburg.com/shop.
Our favorite bookstore in Gettysburg is For the Historian, located at 42 York Street. It's because they have the best selection of Civil War books in Gettysburg, both new and used. And online, they have even more to choose from. And if the Civil War isn't your thing, that's not a problem. This is For the Historian, after all. They cover history from the ancient world to the 21st century with a strong selection of World War II and American Revolution books. It's astounding how many thousands of titles from Osprey, Savas Beatty, UNC Press, and more they have in their store. And that's because, well, they have a warehouse too. And that's where they keep all the books that are available online at forthehistorian.com. And folks, if you go to forthehistorian.com now and order books until you're blue in the face, be sure you mention that you heard about them on Addressing Gettysburg in the Note to Seller box, and they will refund your shipping costs. And if you prefer to stop by when you're in town, well, you could do that too. Just mention Addressing Gettysburg at checkout, and they'll take 20% off the retail price of your item. So go to forthehistorian.com, or stop by 42 York Street, or you can call them at 717-685-5207. That's forthehistorian.com or 717-685-5207.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
All right, and we are back. Thanks for introducing me, Sam Elliott, and let us go on to our questions. Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to submit questions to and Ask a Guide, you've got to be a patron over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. That's where the elite meet to eat. And we have a lot of fun over there. A lot of other perks, not just getting to watch these episodes well in advance as a first lieutenant, but also ticket discounts when we have events and things like that. And one thing I want to introduce somebody who's here with Zack, is a friend of Zack's, a lieutenant colonel. We have a bona fide lieutenant colonel here with us, Kyle Hatzinger. Hello, Kyle.
Hey, good to have you.
Good to have you?
Good to have me. I'm so excited to be here. I can't even talk for
You're so nervous.
Yeah.
You're a lieutenant colonel. What are you scared of? Why are you? What?
That's well, I'm feeling bad because you were talking about all the ages, and I am woefully behind these guys.
Yeah, but you're not in a time of war.
That is true.
Yeah, you're in peacetime, and so you're going to take it. And plus,
Remember,
it's a totally different process.
They're volunteer commissions too. It's a lot different.
Don't feel bad about yourself. Well, you're not even 40, and you're a lieutenant colonel. I feel bad about myself. I'm 45, and I pretend that I'm on the radio for a living.
We can brevet you. That's easy.
Oh, I would love that. Just as long as I can legitimately call myself colonel or general and say, well, no, I've been breveted by Lieutenant Colonel Hatzinger.
Yeah, and you've got stars on your chair, so
I do.
You're ready.
Yeah, well, because this is my organization. But I used to have 1 star on this jacket, and I promoted myself.
I'll send it to the colonel, but pre-Civil War Army, John DeBarth Walbach. John DeBarth Walbach was the colonel of one of the U.S. artillery units. He died in 1857, and he was commissioned in 1799. In the Army. He died in 1857, and he had 12 years, I think, in the Prussian service.
Really?
Think about that, because there's no retirement system.
Right.
Civil War.
God.
This guy was a commissioned officer for 58 years in the United States Army. He died at his desk on active duty, and I think down at Fort McHenry. He was in charge of one of the artillery units. I think that might have been the 3rd U.S.
That's my biggest fear is, work until I die.
This guy here, he's a good shape.
Yeah, right.
The regular Army.
Well, that's the old adage of the Army song. The Army goes rolling along. They roll you out. Somebody rolls right in.
That's it.
Keep on going.
That's it. These guys can't take the field. They're so old.
Right. Mike, I see your comment there. Just ask it in the comments, and I'll because I don't have time to stop the show and open up the phone. So just ask it in the comments, and I'll get to it. Okay, so we're going to start off with Rick Scarce. He says, do we have a sense of how close to the line of fire Hall himself was during Pickett's charge? In a defensive situation like that, was there a prescribed location for a brigade commander, or was the idea that they would move around as needed? This is a good question. I've always wondered this. Hollywood depicts things one way. Then you read accounts about, a general leading from the front and all this stuff. How common was that? Where were they supposed to be? And did they have obviously they had the discretion to go wherever the hell they wanted to go. But when I had Hessler on the other day, we were talking about Humphrey's division, and we were talking about Humphrey at Fredericksburg, and he supposedly led from the front, right? And I said, but really, did he? Did he lead from the front of the Second Brigade in line? Would he be there ahead of his whole division on horseback?
Probably not for long.
But that's what I'm saying. It's you're going behind, you're going up against guys behind a wall who have had enough time to really hone in their aim, because you're not the first wave of attack, right? So how did he survive? So I wonder sometimes about what exactly do they mean when these generals are leading from the front? Does it mean they're at the front or they're in front of the brigade? I mean, I know we have certain ones like Custer who are there ahead of everybody else. What do you think? Go ahead.
Well, I think that's a good question. I'm sure Wayne can talk about this in more detail, but I think one of the unusual things about a guy like Armistead actually is he does lead from the front, literally himself in front of the brigade. And I think that's relatively unusual. But with specific to Hall, first of all, I don't think Hall was on horseback during the battle. For whatever it's worth, I think he probably was on foot, and I think he was probably simply a few yards behind the front line of infantry, which would again have been the 20th, the 7th, and the 59th.
So essentially right on the line.
Yeah. Because if you look at the account of Frank Haskell, Frank Haskell, if I remember correctly, says he found Hall right behind his line.
There you go. So. Okay.
And when these units go down to support the Union troops on July 2nd, he's turning operational control of these units over to other people. He's not going down there himself to where the night, at least not that I know of. But for July 3rd, he's certainly going to be right behind where that line is. I didn't know. You don't have an account of him being mounted? I've never seen one of him being mounted.
In fact, I don't know of too many commanders at all
No,
other than Hancock.
Webb's on foot.
Webb's on foot.
Yeah.
Gibbon's not on horseback.
Yeah, he's on foot too.
I think the smart ones are not on horseback.
Yeah. Hayes gets on his horse and rides and drags those flags at the end. But he's probably on
It's
foot
pretty
too.
much Hancock and staff officers, I think, who are on horseback.
Right.
Because they have to be relaying orders.
Right,
they
running around.
So the center of the line, that would be where the road is. You think where the road is or forward?
Yeah.
Hancock Avenue.
It's right around.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see then. The next question comes from Frank Garcia. Frank, I don't recognize your name, so I'm imagining you're new to at least submitting questions. Thank you very much for that. You say, and he says to you guys, some books on the Battle of Gettysburg state that the 59th New York broke during the height of Pickett's charge. How did this historical memory develop, and what is the current historical consensus on the performance of the 59th New York during the July 3rd battle?
Take that, Zach. Your baby.
Yeah, this is something that I sort of got interested in quite a few years ago, actually, because I discovered that, as I mentioned before, there were some Ohioans in the 59th New York, and then they turned out to be Ohioans, like basically from my backyard. So discovering their stories and their letter collections and everything was kind of interesting to me. Looking at the books that were written on Pickett's charge, I got to be careful because I don't want to name books just to say, oh, this is wrong.
Right.
You know, it's a lot of work to write a book and try to, especially a book about combat, and try to get everything. I say right, but try to get everything
discernible.
Just so. And so there are some great books on Pickett's charge that I would recommend to anybody, like Earl Hess's book on Pickett's charge. Some great books on the battle in general, like Stephen Sears' Gettysburg book. Which nonetheless, I think, get this story, this little nugget of the Gettysburg story wrong. And that doesn't mean they're bad books. This interpretation it's not long-standing. It started appearing, as far as I can discern, in a book published in, I think, 98. Wayne mentioned the book that says that not a lot of Confederates made it past the Emmitsburg Road. And again, it asks a lot of great questions. It's a cool book. It's an interesting book, but it's a very controversial book. And it's Mike Priest's book, Into the Fight, Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg. And he's a wonderful guy, a phenomenal historian. I disagree with him on this. And a couple other scholars picked it up from there. I think Earl Hess cited Priest's book when Hess wrote his Pickett's Charge book. And then when Sears wrote his book on Gettysburg, he cited Hess.
Okay.
But when you look at the citation that Priest used for this, it's, I believe, an account from Andrew Cowan, who again commanded the artillery behind the Union line. And Cowan said that some troops along the stone wall broke. Now, to some extent, you're like, well, of course they did, right? I mean, it's either break or get your head blown off by canister.
Right.
Okay,
right.
so it's not a very difficult decision. And it's possible, perhaps even likely, that some of those guys were from the 59th New York. But I'm pretty sure that the guys Cowan is talking about, because of a couple things. First of all, he mentions in a letter written some years after the battle that they were from two companies of the 69th Pennsylvania, he said. He names the 69th Pennsylvania. Now, he may have gotten that wrong. Sure, it's combat. Sure. You know, there's a lot going on. He may have gotten that wrong. He says they were rallied by General Webb and drawn off to the right of my battery. Okay? And then in another account...
And just for the audience's sake, where's Cowan placed?
Cowan is placed basically behind the left of the 69th Pennsylvania and probably the right of the 59th New York.
So
south of the
copse of trees, though.
5 guns south of the copse of trees. One gun overshoots its mark when it's deploying, and it ends up supporting Cushing.
And if I'm not mistaken, that's the battery that has the plugged... That one tube that's plugged.
That's Brown. No,
that's not Brown. That's
isn't that Woodruff?
Just to the left, right on the road. Just
this is the one.
No, that's Brown's battery.
Yeah, this is the one that has the double canister 10 yards. You know, the monument to double canister 10 yards. That's Cowan.
The one that has a Confederate battle flag on it because it shows
that's right.
Confederate.
I think that's.
Yeah,
I'll look it up. Brown's battery, I think, is a smoothbore.
It's Napoleon's.
Yeah.
So I think
this
is
not a second line today. Right. That's back behind the road. So where he's talking about is right opposite this gate. You know, Cowan talks about shooting when the Confederates come through there.
So I think what's happening is that some of the 59th guys are basically being hurled back by the Virginians as they go forward, probably about the same time that those guys from the 69th Pennsylvania essentially pull out and dash through the trees to get away from the canister fire. Remember, I got accounts from the 59th saying they're being trampled basically by Confederates as they break through. So it's all chaos. It's all confusion. There's the long story short of it is that there's no account that specifically identifies the 59th New York as breaking. The argument stems from Cowan's account of things and the fact that the 59th suffered slightly fewer casualties than the unit to their right, 69th Pennsylvania, and the unit to their left, the 7th Michigan. Now, again, I think if you go out to the battlefield and go out in front of the 59th New York and look back, you can pretty much see why they suffered fewer casualties.
Right.
One of the accounts, the guy whose letter collection is in the Park Library here, Jacob Bechtel was his name. He was from Ohio. He says, we would have suffered a lot more if it hadn't been for that ledge of rocks and bushes right in front of our line. But it kind of concealed us from the enemy. And like I said, I've got accounts from other members of the regiment who talk about specific things that happened during the repulse. So, again, this story sort of metastasized over the course of a few books about Gettysburg and Pickett's charge more specifically being written to the point where they kind of extended Cowan's argument and said, like, well, the 59th New York, I think I saw one account. I can't remember exactly what book it is. One history, but the book said like the 59th broke during the bombardment and was never heard from again, that sort of a thing. And it's like, I mean, if that's true, where did they go? Like there's a provost line behind Cemetery Ridge. There's an account from James K.P. Scott, who was of the 1st Pennsylvania Cavalry, talking about how his company was mounted, sabers drawn behind Cemetery Ridge, behind Hall's and Webb's brigades.
Wow.
All right. Where did the regiment go?
Yeah.
They're the provost. So they're going to shoot down anybody.
And so
I didn't even think of that.
When Cowan writes about seeing guys break, in one of the accounts that he writes, it's clear to me he says, I went to the top of the rise and saw Webb's men break. What that indicates to me is when he talks about guys, I don't even want to use the phrase running away because it's like what they're doing is they're clearing the field of fire of the artillery. So the artillery can do its job.
So they don't get torn to bits.
All right. But to me, what that sounds like is he's going up to check on that lone gun that's like in the copse or right next to the copse. All right. When he sees these guys being rallied by Webb and drawn off to the right of his battery. So the whole thing, like it metastasized from there, I think, into basically historians saying something that the source record did not indicate. And it's based on circumstantial evidence that I don't think bears up to scrutiny.
So it's
my opinion. I wrote a couple pieces in Gettysburg magazine about it many years ago, and I stand by it. I don't think that there's really any veracity to it. I do believe that Hall's right started to basically crowd south to clear Cowan's field of fire.
Right.
But to open up that gap sort of that Wayne was talking about, the Confederates funneled their breakthrough into. But as far as like a large scale collapse of any part of Hall's line, that is not borne out by any of the documentation. Period.
I was correct. Cowan's battery is the one with the plugged tube. It's 3-inch ordnance pieces. Right. It would be, let me think, it would be the southeast corner of the copse of trees, just to the left of the high water mark.
There's 2 guns there. So,
yeah, that one there. Okay. Next question.
I meant to talk so briefly about the 59th.
Yes, sir.
Before I move on.
Go ahead.
One of the reasons that people suspect the 59th may have broken And again, I believe they're wrong about that, but one of the reasons is because of they lost their really good regimental commander beforehand on the evening of July 2nd. Okay, this guy who would the 59th had a lot of leadership problems before Gettysburg. Their commander at Fredericksburg, a guy named William Northedge, had embezzled a lot of regimental funds. He had been drunk. He had threatened his subordinates and cussed them out and everything. So he's brought up on charges.
Okay.
And the guy who ended up replacing him reinstilled all this discipline in the unit right before Gettysburg, kind of the way Webb was tasked with doing with the Philadelphia Brigade.
Okay.
And his name was Max Tomman.
Oh, yes.
Okay. So Maximilian August Tomman, 33 years old at Gettysburg, is the most interesting guy in the world. He is born in Prussia. He attends the Hanover Lyceum, and in 1848, he joins the armies of the German Confederation against Denmark in the First Schleswig-Holstein War. This is one of these 1848 Revolutionary Wars that ravages that part of Europe, and he serves in General Ludwig von der Tann's Light Corps of the Prussian Army or the German Confederation more broadly. I'm not exactly sure. That lasts until 1851. After 1851, he emigrates to the United States and settles in New York and starts raising mercenaries for something called the English Foreign Legion that's going to send Americans to go fight in the British Army in the Crimean War. He's brought up on federal charges for that because that's illegal.
Good.
To raise mercenaries to go fight wars for England. He basically escapes prosecution for that by joining a mercenary campaign in Central America called William Walker's Filibuster Expedition. If your viewers or listeners haven't heard of this, oh my God, go read about it. Okay. This is a Southern gentleman who basically was trying to extend a slave empire into Central America in 1854 and 1855. So he raises a private army of mercenaries. These are guys from the United States who go fight with him either because they're pro-slavery themselves or just for something to do, or in the case of Max Tomman, because they're running from the law. And they go down to Central America and fight to establish this quasi-American colony in Nicaragua. And that's where Max Tomman is. But rather than fight once he gets down there, he decides he wants to open a liquor store. So he opens a liquor store in Granada, Nicaragua, at the height of Walker's filibuster expedition. And when Walker's expedition falls apart, he loses everything. His liquor store gets ransacked and everything. And he comes back to New York City, where he opens a liquor store in Manhattan. He's not the only veteran of this filibuster expedition, though, to fight in the Civil War or even at Gettysburg.
There are a number at Gettysburg.
There are a number at Gettysburg. So Thomas Smythe, who commanded a brigade in Hayes Division farther down the line, was a veteran of the filibuster expedition. He was an Irishman, right? Or Irish-American, at least. And
Burkett Fry.
Who
commanded Archer's Brigade.
He commanded Archer's Brigade.
Very
he is a veteran of the filibuster expedition.
And they're fighting against him.
So was the colonel that Tomman had replaced, that had cussed him out and everything.
How
Colonel
about
Northedge. So there's this underground mercenary group in not just the Union Army, but in sort of both armies.
Yeah.
You speak about the Masonic Brotherhood. There's this William Walker filibuster expedition veteran brotherhood in both armies.
We should say, and it's not funny, we should say Walker was executed for that.
He was.
Walker gets executed.
He gets killed down
he gets shot.
in Honduras, I think.
The rebels tell him to kneel, and he says an American kneels only before his God. And then they shot and executed him.
Wow.
So Tomman comes back to New York.
Jesus.
And raises Company C, which is a largely German regiment. And he's wounded at Antietam, wounded badly in the neck. And from the regimental adjutant who joins the unit in early 1863, a guy named William Pullman, who himself is a fascinating guy. He was born on the island of Borneo in Southeast Asia to Christian missionaries, and then came to the United States as a young man after his mother passed away in 1845, I think, and his dad died in a shipwreck. off the coast of Hong Kong. So he comes to the United States. He joins the regiment as its adjutant, and he and Tomman are like this. They like reinstill all the discipline in this unit. And Pullman writes about his experience with Tomman as his commander. I know it's confusing, Tomman and Pullman. Pullman writes, "Our Lieutenant Colonel Max Tomman is just Northage's reverse, a noble, two-hearted soldier, one well acquainted with his duty and fearless in the performance of it. He's a queer-looking person, short, fat, and Dutch. In fact, a regular Knickerbocker Dutchman. He goes around the army on a bobtail bay horse, completely filling up one of our large army saddles, not a particle of room to spare. He's known far and wide as the Jack of Diamonds. I have no idea why. His good common sense, impartial justice, bravery, and soldierly qualities command the respect of the highest generals in our army." So Tomman is mortally wounded on the evening of July 2nd. A shell crushes his shoulder. He's taken back to, I think, the Sarah Patterson farm initially, and then from there to the Schwartz farm, the main Second Corps field hospital, where he dies, I think, 9 days later. His last request was to be buried as close to where he fell as possible. So he is tied for the second highest ranking Union officer buried in the National Cemetery. You can find him in the New York plot.
Wow.
Pullman, the regimental adjutant, was wounded during the cannonade, and he was 21 years old. I mean, he's a kid out there.
Right.
He's wounded during the cannonade, wounded in the shell as well by a shell.
Shoulder.
Wounded in the shoulder as well by a shell, and he says, "No, I'm not. As long as I got a hand left to hold my sword, I'm staying." Well, during the assault, he gets shot through the arm. He supposedly faints at least once on the way back to the Patterson farm to be treated. He's taken to the
Swope House.
The Swope House. Very good.
Thank you.
Very good. They have the Pullman room upstairs.
Yeah.
And that's where he dies, I think, on July 21st.
We had Kelly Gormley on. She wrote a book about Swope Manor. And he and her have the same birthday.
Oh, cool.
So she just liked to go visit there.
Yeah.
And then she heard his story and found out they had the same birthday. And she's like, I got to write a book about this place.
Have you been to his grave? He's in Albany Rural.
No, I've not. In Albany.
He's in Albany Rural. I've been to his grave. There are other Gettysburg men. Adolph von Steinwehr. Is in there, and one of the presidents, Arthur, one of the presidents.
I don't know.
Albany Rural Cemetery, tremendous.
That's interesting. There's a lot of cool graves that I want to go to. Because that's the closest you'll ever get to meeting the people. Just go to their grave.
The guy who ends up commanding the regiment then during Pickett's charge is a guy named William McFadden. He's an Ohioan. He had been one of these guys who went to California before the war during the gold rush. So he spent 4 years out in California. When he came back to Ohio, apparently he did not strike gold. That's, if you're coming back to Ohio, it's probably because you didn't, you either, people only leave Ohio when they go to like base or something else. But he got on a ship to come back to, he would cross the isthmus at Panama and come back up. Got in a shipwreck. Some like 200 people died or something. He was one of the few who survived. So he he escapes from prison after he's captured later in the war. So these are tough guys.
Yeah.
I mean, these are really tough sons of guns.
Different life back then.
Yeah.
I mean, just the whole mercenary thing alone. Like who today would do? I'm sure there are people today that would do that. But I know they are. John DeMario says, I have some questions about captured battle flags and the controversy behind their capture. There were several Medal of Honor recipients from Hall's Brigade who captured Confederate battle flags. There is also an account from the 69th PA that suggests after the attack was repulsed, he witnessed soldiers picking them up off the field in front of his regiment, one of whom he described as having a .42 on top of his kepi. He did not seem happy about it. In another account, Major Curtis of the 7th Michigan claims one of his soldiers captured a Confederate flag after personally shooting the color bearer and was subsequently threatened with a sword by an unknown mounted Federal colonel who then apprehended the captured colors from him. Was this something that often occurred and created controversy after a battle, or did the soldiers on July 3rd realize the magnitude of the battle and want their share of the glory? Also, do you have any theories on the possible identity of the mounted officer that took the flag from Private Deming of the 7th Michigan? That is the end of that question. That's an interesting question.
It is an interesting question, and I brought for Zach, because I want to give him a copy of it, the captured flags from the National Archives from the Second Corps. I've got all of them here.
Oh, neat.
And these are the original reports in the National Archives for captured flags for the Second Army Corps in the Battle of Gettysburg. Everybody that's credited, every flag they took, if they knew what it was. And I got this doing some research on a painting that Dale Gallen did, which depicts Joseph DeCastro that we just talked about. That painting was commissioned for Norwich University because Edmund Rice was a graduate of Norwich. And the 19th Mass got 5 Medals of Honor, and some of the other units, there are Medals of Honor given as well. But so what I can say about this is, first of all, are there flags that are up against a Cushing's artillery gun, for example, or up against some of that somebody ran over and picked up and got? And the answer to that is yes. Are there other flags that are actually taken in combat, like this one that Nicastro took? And the answer is yes. So they're gathered up in a variety of ways. What's interesting, at least if you look at who's credited with getting these flags and Medal of Honors are issued. Now, Rice gets a Medal of Honor for gallantry and meritorious service. He doesn't get one for the capture of a flag. But the men of the 19th Mass, the others, get them for capture flags. From what I can tell in looking at this is even if these flags were given to a colonel or given to someone else, the original person that got the flag is the person that the citation is. So a colonel taking his flag, that colonel didn't get the Medal of Honor.
Yeah.
The man that
but who would recommend him for the Medal of Honor?
The recommendations or the captures of flags. Now, many of these don't follow a Medal of Honor process like that you and I might be used to.
Okay.
So many of these Civil War medals are given after the fact, or given in the 1890s, and you have to have collaborating evidence as to why. And by the way, in that period, you could actually put yourself in for the Medal of Honor, which people did.
And it was only living recipients, right?
Right, and that's another whole discussion.
So Hall couldn't get it.
That's a whole other discussion we could have, because Cushing and Congress and giving that medal, that was not precedent for Civil War.
But Webb got it, right? Didn't Webb get the Medal of Honor?
Webb got the Medal of Honor, but Webb wasn't dead.
No, but I'm saying Webb said something about, if I remember correctly, like Hall could have gotten it too, in essence, but he wasn't alive.
Yeah. Cushing gets it in 2014, which is outside the process of, and that's a whole other discussion of whether or not that was Cushing a brave guy, and did they do things there? The answer is yes, but that's not precedent in Civil War. Precedent in Civil War is you survive, you're not even put in if the action isn't. But these medals, a lot of these are early. They're 1864 medals, which means there aren't documentation where people are putting in to say, hey, this guy deserves one. These
the war's not even over yet.
Flags, and these are put in. So the ones for the 19th Mass, DeCastro gets credit for his citation reads like the 19th, but it's actually the 14th Virginia. Benjamin Falls gets credit for the 19th Virginia flag, which is in Garnett's brigade. Benjamin Jellison is one that supposedly picked up the flag, and that's written by Captain Adams, who also is a Medal of Honor recipient at Fredericksburg for this brigade. There's a writing that he has about Jellison. Jellison gets the 57th Virginia, which is in Armstead's.
He's the guy that at the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania, I think, is like singing Battle Hymn of the Republic or something while they're fighting at the Bloody Angle. Seriously.
Okay.
Or not the Bloody Angle,
but the East Angle. He's got like a Mollis account later on. He writes about it later on.
Crazy.
The flag of the 48th Georgia was captured by a sergeant in the 59th New York, and the flag of the 18th Virginia is credited to the 59th New York as well. So these are men that... they got the flags. These are not like I gave it to a colonel and then the colonel got the citation. I don't see that, at least in the writings that I have. And unfortunately, some of these flags we don't have positive identification on. So some of them is unknown. And Richard Rollins, in his book, Damn Flags of the Rebellion, which came out many years ago, he tried to list which ones were found. Now, some of these have recently come to light. The 11th Virginia flag, which no one knew what happened to it, came up at a dealer show and exists today, and it looks like it was captured by the 16th Vermont.
Oh,
that makes sense.
And this is a flag. Brigade, it had a tag on it. It had. But the whereabouts of that flag and its fate had been unknown for over 150
I think I saw a video of that. Wasn't that a couple of years ago, like 2 or 3 years ago? I'm
not sure it was that one.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
This one was taken, and I've seen that flag. It was out of in a pie container, basically.
Yeah, no, the one I saw was rolled up.
Yeah, that's a different one.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
That's a different one.
Yeah, okay.
So this one is, but so anyway, there are a listing of these flags. So let us just say that I don't see a case where a colonel that rode off with one of these flags actually got the Medal of Honor.
Okay, gotcha.
That it did go to someone that is getting credit. Now, did it mean that they actually took it in action? No, doesn't mean that they actually took it in action.
One of the things I think that's really interesting about all the stuff we've been talking about today that we need to, it's kind of obvious, but it bears repeating, I think, and it points to something John DeMario mentions in his question. The reason it matters, like, to so many of us nerds who do this, like, why, did this regiment capture the flag, or did that or did this guy capture the flag and got it stolen from somebody else, or did this regiment break, or did that regiment break, or were they posted right here, right there? It's because it's Gettysburg, and even more importantly than that, it's Pickett's charge.
Yeah,
This is an event that is absolutely freighted with meaning
and
importance.
Yeah.
And that's why they cared so much about it. That's why they cared so much about it, I think, at the time, but certainly in years later, even more so. And that's why we still care about it as well. You don't hear historians, writing and arguing about which regiment captured a flag at Mine Run or Bristow Station. As much as I love studying those campaigns because they're in my backyard, they're not Gettysburg.
Yeah.
And that's why this stuff is significant, because we make it significant.
So the archives records have, the 19th Mass getting 4 of these, at least. The 42nd Mass.
New York, 42nd New York.
42nd New York, I'm sorry. And the official record said they have one listed for the 22nd North Carolina here.
Yes, I've seen that. Yeah, that one was picked up.
And the 48th Georgia. So that's the flag.
Wright's
and
brigade.
this is July 31st, 1862, headquarters 3rd Brigade. So this is the brigade report, and it looks like Colonel Mallon is the one that, because on the 31st, probably Hall, is he sick or he's gone?
Not there.
He's not
out.
there.
It's Mallon.
So
Mallon's
that's the official writing for Hall, and the flag's credited for Hall's brigade.
The colors of the 48th Georgia were captured, obviously, on the evening of July 2nd by Jim Wiley, who was an Ohioan in the 59th New York.
Yeah.
And I actually corresponded with the descendant of the individual who carried the flag of the 48th Georgia in that assault. Very nice lady, and she was she gave me some material relevant to that particular story. Wiley, though, who was credited with capturing the flag, he was the color bearer of the 59th New York. So there's another instance where you have a color bearer grabbing the colors of a Confederate regiment. It's a pretty interesting circumstance. Wiley goes on to be captured with much of the brigade at the Jerusalem Plank Road in June 1864. He's taken to Andersonville, and he dies 2 months and 2 days before the war's end.
So to answer the question, which we did, they come in a variety of forms. The 3rd Brigade is credited, at least in this report from Mallon, for seven flags, that they got for Pickett's charge, but or not all for Pickett's charge. 48th Georgia would have been the night before.
But that's
there. Sergeant Wiley, which you mentioned, and he is the one listed here. So the 2nd Corps got a tremendous amount of flags. This documentation actually has a listing for all the 2nd Corps flags. But these had War Department capture numbers, and they went down in most cases.
Yeah.
And obviously that's unprecedented in Civil War combat.
Sure.
To lose dozens of flags that the Army of Northern Virginia did on July 3rd, 1863. So I'm not saying like it's significant because we make it significant and it wasn't significant at the time. Right. This is unusual. This is a big deal.
Yeah. But it's a good thing you clarified that, because somebody would be like, "Woo."
But it's Gettysburg.
It is.
No, I mean, and that's why it's probably amplified. But it is important in and of itself. Yeah. It is remarkable, I should say. All right, and then finally we have Michael 6 Questions Lentz. He's got a question in the comments section here. He wants to know. He says Norman J. Hall comments that he has a reputation of being a terrible talker, being one that talks constantly and quickly. What was his reputation among his brother officers? Did they like him? Did they find him to be a pain in the ass?
I've not heard that about.
Well, if anybody's going to find something obscure, it's going to be Michael 6 Questions Lentz.
That's all right. That's awesome. I don't know. Maybe that's why he wasn't promoted because
he talked too much.
Maybe he was a fast talker or a close talker or something like that.
Bad breath.
Right? I mean,
a close talker with chronic halitosis. There's nothing worse.
I don't know.
He's going to have to take a ticket to get behind the Ohioans as far as fast talkers are concerned. We're known for the fastest talkers around where Zack and I are from. So he's going to have to take a ticket behind that.
He did move to New York right before the war, so that might have had something to do with it as well.
Might have had something to do with
learning to be a fast talker.
Yeah.
I can't say I've heard that account. I think his reputation among the brother officers, you had brought that up, of that he had close friends that were in the 19th Massachusetts. I mean, and certainly the senior officers earmarked him as someone that had great potential.
Yeah.
No question about that.
I can't imagine how you couldn't have. I mean, he sounds like a pretty solid officer.
And I think, he's a solid officer. Am I saying like he's the best brigade commander in the Army of the Potomac? How you would measure that, I don't even know. But not necessarily. I mean, he's a solid, dependable, competent guy to have on your team. Absolutely.
Well, guys, thank you very much for your time. This is good. I mean, we're at 2.5 hours here. This is almost, I think you're giving Tom Berenger a run for his money as far as length of show goes, but I had a great time. This was a lot of fun.
Out everything I say, and
just make it all Wayne.
You'll have a good podcast.
No, that's not true. You guys were great. Wayne, we have to do a show about the Masons.
Yeah, that would be
fun.
There's a lot of interesting stories related to that, and I want to thank you for having me here today, and I want to thank Zack for asking me to come as a guide to be with him. I'm honored.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
Zack, thank you for thinking of doing this, because this was a lot of fun, and I love this because I love when someone else suggests an idea and we get something that I never thought of, and it's this obscure brigade, but they're not obscure. They're in the middle of Pickett's charge. Like, they did a lot, and they deserve to be known about. Kyle, thank you for your monitoring of the comment section in the back there, and your service, of course, your service as well, sir.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for listening. Thanks to the patrons for watching and sending in the questions, and we'll talk to you all next time. Whether you're a history enthusiast, reenactor, or someone seeking a unique piece of the past, the Badge Maker has something for everyone and anyone. Don't miss out on owning a piece of history. Shop now at CivilWarCorpsBadges.com and elevate your connection to the Civil War era. That's CivilWarCorpsBadges.com. Thanks for listening.
Our hearts so stout have got us fame, for soon 'tis known from whence we came. Wherever we go, they dread the name of Gary Owen in glory. Instead of spa, we'll drink down ale and pay the reckoning on the nail. No man for debt shall go to jail from Gary Owen in glory. Instead of spa, we'll drink down ale and pay the reckoning on the nail. No man for debt shall go